The minutes from September 25th were distributed. Are there any comments, any changes, any corrections? Do I hear a motion to approve the minutes?
So moved.
All in favor? Aye. Any opposed? Thank you. It is unanimous. And also, there has been distributed at the table, and there will be entered in the record, some follow-up emails from Sean Cronin and one from Sergio that followed up on the meeting of last week. You all received these by email. They'll just become part of the record, so that will be on the committee's website. And the last issue to discuss on a preliminary basis, we are meeting on the 9th, and then we will not be able to meet on the 16th, but would like to chat a little bit about a meeting on the 23rd, on Wednesday the 23rd. That happens to be the Senior Center benefit, and I know, Kevin, you've mentioned that, and I know that that is an issue for me. And I was just wondering how people would feel about meeting a little bit earlier on that day. Would that make it possible, Kevin, for you?
I'd have to leave early because I
Yeah.
should be there by, I don't have to be there exactly at 6, but I shouldn't be there at 7:30 or whatever.
Okay. Or should we just not meet or go on at our regular time and deal with that?
What's on the agenda?
Not sure at this point. I think, I mean, Susan, you can jump in here. Our thinking was that next week we would try to wrap some numbers around some of the recommendations that the capital and operating recommendations, and actually start discussing questions. There have been a number of questions that I've received from people, that we've received from people, that I've been pulling together, issues that have been raised both by members of the committee and third parties outside, citizens outside the committee. And I think we have to start sorting through those and prioritizing those. And I don't know whether next week we'll have people will start picking questions to work on, but it may be that we'll get those questions out next week, maybe some other questions, and the 23rd would be answers coming back from town staff to some of those. I'm not sure. I think it depends really on the turnaround.
Yeah, we'll have homework at the end of tonight for folks, but that's essentially right. I think the question is whether we would want to miss 2 weeks, let 2 weeks go by and not meet again until the end of October.
And also, if it's a discussion meeting and not a presentation meeting, then that's our real work, and it's impossible for someone who has missed to catch up. Whereas a presentation, you could get the information somewhere else. So
Right. Well,
it is
they're all
important for
being
everyone to be
televised, so
there.
people
Yeah.
can watch.
Okay.
Right. I think the question is, number one, if there's only 1 or 2 people with a conflict, should we leave it? Number 2, if people are amenable and could meet a little bit earlier that night, that might be ideal. But if there are like 7 people who can't meet earlier, we don't want to change it. So I guess it would be helpful to hear from folks. Maybe we should just ask the question more specifically. Who would have a conflict if we tried to move it earlier?
What is earlier? 5-ish?
And 5 to 7 instead of 6 to 8?
And that's the 23rd.
The 23rd.
Yeah. I mean, we don't have to decide this tonight. It would be nice if we could, but, if you want to check your calendars, if you're unsure, or if 5 is just out of the question, speak up now.
The other thing we could do is we could put up a doodle for that week and just say, are there different points in time?
Does 8 to 10 work? Is that a possibility
Probably is
for people?
worse.
It's worse. Okay, then we'll take it off.
What do you think?
Given all the
Well, it's
moves.
supposed to run
Take
from
it
6 to 8, so.
Well, okay, well, maybe. So that's, okay. Why don't, we just wanted to raise the issue, and I think getting a doodle out is a good idea, and we'll go from there.
Okay.
Okay, I think, are we ready?
We are, I'm ready.
Dr. Lupini, Mr. Rowe, Dr. Fisher-Mueller, whoever is starting us off?
It's me.
Thank you. So thanks for inviting us. Thanks for having us to talk about really historical elements around the school department and the school budget. I'm going to take you through the first part, and then Peter and I will sort of rotate through other pieces of this. So we really wanted to start tonight by talking more about the philosophical underpinnings of the programs, the strategies that you see in place in the schools. We have a strategic plan that we've been working off of for the last 5 years that we're in the process now of revising, but that includes, and the school district has had in place 4 of these 5 core values for quite some time, prior to even to that strategic plan. Pardon?
Decades.
Yeah, decades. And they are high achievement for all, excellence in teaching, collaboration among our staff and with parents, respect for human differences, and what became really important for us and important enough that the school committee included as a core value a number of years ago is the concept of educational equity. And I start with those and then put this slide up because those core values drive our decisions. They drive the programs that we put in place. They drive the strategies that we put in place here. And I'll just cite a couple of examples. We have a number of things that Peter's going to take you through tonight and talk about costs of those issues. And my particular part is to talk about how they support these core values. So for example, in High Achievement for All, we have a comprehensive high school. We don't have to have a comprehensive high school. Many high schools throughout the Commonwealth and other places don't do that. They don't have the array of vocational programs. They don't have the array of arts programs that we have and have supported and hope to be able to support into the future. They make a very different decision about their high school. For example, if students want vocational offerings, they in some other places go to the regional vo-tech school. We have very few students who do that. Most of them take advantage of the number of programs we have here. We made a very conscious decision a number of years ago to house BATV at Brookline High School. We had a very specific strategy in mind. First of all, we thought it was great for the community to have that located there, but we also got a TV studio out of it. We also got animation studios out of it. Our kids are flooding those classes, and many of them are choosing to go into careers in those areas, and they didn't have that opportunity before. So that drives that particular decision as an example. We'll talk some about this tonight. I'm sure you'll have questions for Peter and me. Under Excellence in Teaching, we have a materials fee program in this district. Many districts have such a program for staff who don't reside in Brookline to enroll their children in the school district. Some of those programs in other districts are negotiated as part of a collective bargaining agreement, and staff pay nothing in those districts to do that. Here, it was a policy decision that was arrived at back in the late 80s, and staff pay the equivalent of the materials necessary for their students to support their students and their students' enrollment. And you're going to see that the numbers are large. It also helps us attract the teaching staff, the administrative staff that we attract, and keep them here because their students can only stay enrolled as long as they continue to work here. The other one under there is the staff daycare. We don't run that, but staff daycare is run at the Baldwin School. They don't pay rent for that space. They provide a program for kids who birth to 3. Actually, I think it's 4. And a number of our teachers can come back to work quicker because they have a place where their students can go. And so that's another way of supporting our educators. We have a lot of collaborations. You see a number of them there. Many of them I'm sure you know, with the Education Foundation, the 21st Century Fund. A couple that you may not know about is a really active partnership with Brookline Mental Health, where they have counselors who are available in our schools to support students. And they have a great relationship with us around a number of programs, one of which is over under Educational Equity. That's a program called BRIGHT. It was really the first in the Commonwealth. It's a program designed to support students in their return from hospitalization settings or other situations that prevent them from coming back to school full-time. So they can come back to school part-time. They get support from counselors through the Bright program at the high school, and it's so successful it's been replicated at the last time I looked, 10 to 12 high schools throughout the Commonwealth and other parts of the country as well. We're actually talking now about such a program and what it would look like at the elementary level, at least in 7th and 8th grade as well. So respect for human differences, we are really proud of, in regular education and in special education, our focus on programs. So you'll see two of them noted there, the School Within a School program, which has been here since the 70s, I believe, was first started here in the 70s. As one student said to me once when he was trying to describe to me students who went into SWS, we're the kids that don't belong downstairs. We're the kids that don't necessarily fit in classes downstairs. This is a small setting environment with a core of essentially four academic teachers who support the learning of those students in a democratic environment. An opportunity for change are, quite frankly, students who, if it weren't for programs like OFC, wouldn't be here and would add to our dropout statistics, because these are students who need a different type of learning environment, and we're able to provide it here. Many, many, many high schools don't do that. They take a look at those students and they put them in out-of-district placements or other kinds of programs. We offer those programs for students here. And then under educational equity, you'll see an array of programs that we've put in place or that have been put in place over time and that we've worked with to essentially alleviate and working toward eliminate achievement gaps. Two that I'll mention on there are the Calculus Project, which you may have read about some in the newspapers. This is a program where we begin working with students of color beginning in 7th grade around trying to have them enroll in and succeed in upper-level math classes. When that program began, there were no students of color in upper-level math classes in this district, and I believe the present 11th grade has 7? I think there are 15 total in upper-level math classes at the upper levels of the high school now, somewhat as a result of that program and other supports that we've put in place. And the other that I'm sure you know something about is Steps to Success, which has now been here for, I think, 10 or 11 or 12 years. This is a program that essentially is wraparound services for students in public housing. When Steps to Success began, the percentage of students out of public housing who were going on to college was less than 20%. Today, it meets our district-wide percentages. 10 years ago, this district paid nothing for anything having to do with Steps to Success. It was all done through grants or outside fundraising. We took over the staffing, the director, and the four main coordinators of that program a number of years ago because it really meets our goals and our core vision. So the other piece of this is just to say these things and others, mainly the things on this list, are policy choices. And they're policy choices around a set of goals and objectives that the school committee, that we believe this town has set for its schools, and that we put money into because we believe they make a difference in meeting the goals that are in that strategic plan and the vision of what this public school system is supposed to be. I'll start with some obvious ones. A pre-K through 8 model. So a pre-K through 8 model, as we find time and time again when we test it with this community, is the model of choice in this community. We've heard that over and over again, all the way back to the MGT report that we did a number of years ago. As Henry Warren, who used to be a member of the school committee, said to me once, a K-8 model is not efficient. It's not an efficient model, particularly at the middle grades, right? We have a lot of what we call dangling FTEs, 0.2s, 0.4s that are necessary if you're to provide a middle-level program. Particularly years ago in our smaller schools, there was much more of that. But it's not an efficient model, but it's a great model in that it cuts down on the number of transitions for kids. It provides a continuous environment for kids for 9 years, more than that if we have a pre-K in the building, which we used to have in many of them. And as I said, it's the model that this district has had great success with. This district values small class sizes. You're going to hear tonight, see numbers that show that even though we've grown by whatever number of students, our average class size at the elementary level is 0.5 students larger than it was in 2004 when this enrollment growth began. That's a policy choice. It's because we believe that makes a difference. You'll see it in every budget message that I put forward to the school committee over all that time. We believe it makes a difference in terms of the academic achievement of our students, and we've made choices to support that and to not fund areas like guidance counselors and other areas because of the funding that we had available. That's a choice. This district chooses to run, and I think it's absolutely the right thing to do, a very vibrant early childhood program. I think you'll see numbers that Peter will show tonight that this strategy and others among them have led to some great trends recently in special education. But beyond that, it gets students into our district at age 3 in quality programming that allows us to look at their needs as they enter kindergarten, and we believe to reduce future needs that they may have as well. A broad array of athletic program is a policy choice. This district has a number of athletic offerings that are not done in every public school system. That's a choice. We choose to focus on Brookline students educated in Brookline. Where that comes up primarily is in special education. So I'll give you a number that anticipates a chart that Peter's going to show you. Sorry, Peter. In 2004, when I came here, we had about 85 students in out-of-district placements in the district. That means they went to a special education school somewhere other than here because someone had determined that there wasn't appropriate programming here for them. Okay? Now, we're X number of students larger today, and we have 68 students in out-of-district placements. We've reduced the number of students in out-of-district placements, but we've done that through program building, by building appropriate programs for them here. One, because we think it's a better investment of our dollars, it's cheaper. But two, and really important to me, is it allows Brookline students to remain in Brookline. Same kinds of strategy around the K-1 paraprofessional model. When I came to the district, we had some number of paraprofessionals, and when you really tried to look at the paraprofessionals, particularly one-to-one paraprofessionals who were supporting students with IEPs, they were all over the map in terms of the grade levels. We focused them in K and 1. Now they're not devoted to one student. They're not there necessarily just for special education, but we followed the lead of some districts that had tried to do this actually in K through 2, which was our original goal, still is. And found that in places where they'd done where they put paraprofessionals in place at those grade levels, they'd actually prevented students from needing one-to-one assignments and therefore reduced their numbers in later grades. And that's exactly what's happening here now. A commitment to METCO. Again, you're going to see a lot more on the METCO numbers. This district is one of the original members of METCO, which was a voluntary desegregation program from Boston. We are the second largest program. We have 300 students here. That's our target number. We're always in the 290 to 300 range of students who come here from METCO, and you'll see the disbursement of them throughout our grade levels. I talked about materials fee. I talked about staff daycare. Extended day is a policy choice. This district in the early 80s began a relationship with its parents to offer extended day programming after school. We don't charge them rent. There are many other districts where they have after-school programming where they contract out for it, where they're paid for it. This district chose not to go in that direction in the early 80s, and we still don't. But providing that kind of programming in partnership with parents was a policy choice. Inclusionary classrooms, we met most of our students, while we have some that are in classrooms where they are not included for any part of the day. The vast majority of our students, and we're very proud of it, spend some part or most of their day in a regular education classroom, no matter what their IEP may say, right? No matter how no matter what their needs may be, they're supported in a regular education classroom for the most part in some fashion. To the point where at the high school now, and I think you'll hear a bit about this, we have a number of classes that are co-taught. That is, there's a number of students in regular education who are in those classes with students who have IEPs, co-taught by, let's say, a science teacher and a special educator, so that those students can be included in a regular science class. And then there are a number of these regular education interventions, because one thing you're going to see tonight, I feel like I'm stealing a bunch of your stuff, sorry. One thing you're going to see tonight is that we've, for I think about the third consecutive year, reduced special education as a percentage of our overall budget. That doesn't happen by accident, right? It happens because you have appropriate regular education interventions in place that prevent parents from believing that they need that legal document to get what they need for their child, right? So if you can prove that you can do it with regular education interventions, you're going to begin to reduce those percentages. And we've reduced the percentage of kids who are on IEPs, we've reduced special education as a percentage of our budget. And it's happened through pieces like the 4+1 program at the high school, which is a tutorial model that provides tutoring centers for kids who need additional help in small groups, through math specialists, through literacy specialists, and through a very, very active child study team process where our teachers can bring particular situations involving students who may be in need of additional help, who 5 years ago would have been thought to be in need of an IEP, and talk through what the regular education strategies might be that would prevent that and yet get the students the help that they need. Oh, yes.
Do you want questions now, or would you rather save them to the end?
That's your choice.
I'd ask them now, I think.
Good,
as long
okay.
as we're on the
Could you
subject.
put that back up?
I
just
can.
a- Yeah. On the IEPs, how long is a youngster, a family, off an IEP before they are permanently off the IEP? So
Never.
if you- but
That-
they reapply until they're 21 legally. But
it's-
what happens if they're off for a couple of years at the high school?
So see if I answer your question. Yeah, 22 is an age out, right? And some students graduate with their class,
And it's-
and others are here
So,
with us
right.
till they're 22. But there is no sort of number of years until you're off. At any given time, if we're not seeing substantial progress, if a student's not seeing substantial progress, a parent can apply to have that case examined again.
Right, which takes an enormous amount of retesting and assignment
Yes,
time.
yes, the short answer is yes.
Yeah, okay. I'm just thinking about cost issues. SWS, how much more per student do we pay for kids in SWS than we do for the regular? And is SWS still by lottery?
Yes.
School within a school.
My position on SWS is it doesn't cost any more, but that may be something you want to delve into later. And yes, it is still by lottery, although I don't know what the magic is behind it.
Yeah, and I would support what Peter says about the cost piece. I mean, one thing we've done over the last number of years is the teachers who were in SWS used to be exclusively devoted to that program, and they're not any longer. They do teach other sections, so I think the cost is the same.
Okay, the early childhood program, mostly that's BEAP.
Yes.
What kind of waiting list do you have? What percentage of the parents who apply for that get in, and and how many do not? So it's not a universal
so waiting-
program that
so-
we offer.
It's not,
It's
no. So waiting lists, I mean, as we're looking, right now, not much, because people have found a slot for the year. But as we're looking at those, I think the waiting list ranges anywhere from 50 to 100. Oh, hi, Vicki. Why, Vicki Milstein happens to be here. Vicki, waiting list.
We have, we accept about 60% of the weight of the children who apply, so just under half are on the wait list. The wait list doesn't maintain itself.
Right.
Because once
People find a
they don't
placement.
get in, they look for other
Right.
Bill, can you repeat that for the
So,
microphone?
sure, so it's about 50 to 60% of the applicants we're able to take. We have 290 students at any given time. A number of those students, however, are there because they're on IEPs.
Is that completely provided by the school system, or is there a sliding income scale
No, there's
on that?
there's a scale, and
A-
Peter
a
can talk more
sliding
about that in a
income
bit.
scale. Okay, and just one final question.
Mm-hmm.
What percentage of the METCO program does the state reimburse us for?
Peter's going to get to that in some slides.
Okay, thank you.
Yes.
What is the cost to the district of a child who needs to go out of district for special education?
Yes. So it yeah, the cost of an out-of-district placement. So no, out-of-district placements are not all created equal. So we have out-of-district placements that probably range, I'm looking for Karen, probably range in the 35,000 to well over 200,000, plus transportation.
Versus the 16 it costs on average, more or less, for a student to be.
Yes, although our out-of-district programs are more expensive than that 16.
Yeah, right, that's what I'm saying.
Excuse me, our in-district programs, sorry, yes.
You really answered, I was going to ask some questions about the early childhood program, and I think I understand them, but is it 3 and 4-year-olds?
Yes.
3 and 4-year-olds, and what percentage of the children are special ed children that are in that program?
97,
Do you want to
Third.
hear?
a third.
We have between 25 and 40%. It varies by class. We have 2 classes that are substantially separate, where the children, 100% of the children have significant IEPs. That's only for children with a diagnosis on the autism spectrum. Our children with complex medical needs and multiple disabilities are integrated in a class where it is 35% of the class is children with special needs.
So 25 to 40-ish.
And you said that there is a sliding scale. There are some people that pay for that program, for early childhood.
And we
program.
scholarship others, yes,
Scholarship is
yes,
based on ability to pay.
yes.
One last question, Bill, does neighborhood schools as a cost driver, it's a significant cost driver, and.
Sorry, I skipped that one.
Yeah, so can you talk about that
So,
one?
sure. So, you'll look at a chart that shows our class sizes and numbers of students in each school, and you'll say, well, that's interesting. I mean, Peter will show you a slide later on that says our percentages, or our numbers are this, our average is this, but I see 23s, I see 24s, I see 25s. And that's really driven by the fact that I assign students in 2 ways, right? So some students live in the core of a district. They live in the core of that neighborhood. And so if they live in Driscoll, they go to Driscoll, right? And other students reside in a buffer zone, meaning they reside in an area where I have the ability to place them at one of 2 or 3, or in one case, 4 elementary schools. And that's my avenue for balancing enrollments, if you will, right? That's the tool I have. Neighborhood schools simply means, as I've said to the school committee a number of times, unless people will move where I want them, I don't have the ability to sort of balance out those classes. You may look at a decision I make over here to start a class at this school and wonder why I'm not just assigning some of those kids to this school over here. So neighborhood schools are a choice, right? It's a choice. And again, like the K to 8, some people might argue it's not efficient. Does that explain it? Okay.
Was there a cost to the staff daycare for?
To the teachers?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. a separate-
I don't know what it is. It's not us. So, so just a couple minutes, and then I'll turn this over to Peter on some of the issues that we face. I mean, I'm not going to talk with you about capital and operating. I think you know that, and we'll see more evidence of that tonight, and I'm sure in future conversations we have. I mean, we spend a lot of time, and you may have done some reading on our achievement gaps. This is a very high-performing system, and quite frankly, not all students are performing at those levels. And so there's a reason that the school committee identified that particular fifth goal. There's a reason that we devote dollars to projects like the calculus project and to Steps to Success. It's because, quite frankly, X number of years ago, if you looked at the data in this district, the data were good overall until you lifted up the hood. And then they weren't. And we're pretty pleased with the fact that we've been able to make some inroads on a number of those gaps. That becomes particularly important in the fact that not only are we growing, but our demographics are shifting. So this district is less white than it was in 2004. It's a different demographic, and quite frankly, that's more stark at some elementary schools, for example, than it is at others. Special education restructuring. I'll just comment on these other pieces. Peter will talk about the data behind this. I already talked about building programs. That we've done a good job. Let me give you just one example of that. Where we've focused efforts over the last 2 years have been particularly, I guess, at the high school is a good place to talk about. 2 years ago, our sort of comparison of students coming back from out-of-district placements to going out to out-of-district placements was minus 20 at Brookline High School. Minus 20. Now, I need to tell you that's very odd for a high school. Most places don't see students exiting to out-of-district placements at a high school level. But Brookline High School was the one place, I think, in the district where we hadn't built as many programs, hadn't built as many options as we had in other parts of the district to meet the disability profile of the kids we have today. Right now, that's a minus. It's more like -4, -6 in the last year. And it's largely because of two programs, one that we took and brought in some external consultants to help us improve, and another one around language-based issues that we built in partnership with a private school. So we have a program around language-based disorders that we built and implemented this year in partnership with Landmark School. That program is not cheap. The professional development for that program is not inexpensive. But we've been very successful so far at retaining and bringing back students who otherwise would have ended up at Landmark or would have ended up at Carroll. Okay, so that's where that piece is really important. Collective bargaining, Peter's going to talk some about. Sean mentioned, rightfully so, last week that we encounter some issues in collective bargaining that aren't necessarily seen in town collective bargaining agreements. One of them is steps and lanes. And Peter's going to share some on that with you. The 08 override started an elementary world language program here, which we're very pleased with and very proud of, in that we've been able to provide that experience for students beginning in kindergarten. Technology program review, probably not much tonight, but at a future time. We hope to spend some time with you around the vision of technology in this district. And last, only because it occupies most of my day, are, unfortunately these days, are federal and state mandates. So we're spending a lot of time, and if you follow any of what's happening at school committee meetings now, we're having a lot of conversations about the Common Core and what's happening with the Common Core in terms of our state curriculum frameworks and PARC, and particularly right now, a PARC which could be, I should say, our new state assessment 2 years down the road, possibly replacing MCAS, but which is going to be piloted in the Commonwealth this spring, and which we'll be implementing in all of our schools, because we somehow ended up as all of our schools in the 15% of Massachusetts students who are going to be piloted. Imagine that. Educator evaluation, you've probably read some about the new regulations on educator evaluation. And we just recently struck a collective bargaining agreement with our union on the new educator evaluation regulations and our program and what that will look like. And it is time intensive for principals in implementing. The simplest way to say that to you is that the former regulations required that teachers be evaluated, unless they were on improvement plans or otherwise, require that they be evaluated every 2 years, and the new regulations say every employee every year. And so this is a much more intensive process for them in terms of the evaluations, and yes, will drive us to be talking about the number of people who we have evaluating, given that we've increased our teaching staff by the numbers that we've seen over the last number of years. Bullying prevention was another initiative put forward through legislation a number of years ago. And what I will say about all of these, and that we're particularly proud of, is we could very easily meet the letter of the law. Well, maybe I shouldn't say very easily. We could meet the letter of the law on these. And quite frankly, the districts that I see meeting the letter of the law on things like bullying prevention, I don't think are moving the needle one bit. And so we really set out to say on any of these initiatives, how do we make them something we can be proud of here in Brookline and something that will actually benefit students? So the work that we've done in bringing in Olveus and factoring in a number of other pieces of a bullying prevention program, we already, although it's only been 2 years of survey data that we're seeing from our students, but it's already started to move in a positive direction, right? And again, it's not inexpensive. And again, it's time intensive for principals and teachers to do that work. We have a new student discipline law that will become law in July of 2014 that essentially, if I was just to do an overview of it for you, says that no student is expelled. All students are owed an education by their district. So that means our collaborative right now is working to build programming where districts could send students, both whether it's for a short time, 45 days, or on a more permanent basis, because the old days of the principal expels you and you go away are no longer the law as of July 1st of 2014. Bigger issue for some districts than us because, quite frankly, we've always provided some type of alternative program for a student in that situation. And lastly, retail. Retail is a matter of an issue currently underway between the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education and the Justice Department, where the Justice Department found the instruction in a number of Massachusetts districts around students for whom English was not their primary language to be lacking. And so the Justice Department has been in constant negotiations with the Department of Education as to whether there would be fines and or requirements that the department would be under in terms of making sure that all core academic teachers in districts that have significant numbers, that's us, of students for whom English is not their primary language, have the skills to teach those students for whom English is not their primary language. So our teachers have started this year, the first third of them approximately, through the retail training. Doesn't cost us anything right now except teacher time and scheduling time and finding places here for them to take the course, and 3 people who have gotten their certification to teach this course, we're glad they did, who are on our staff and who can provide that training. But it is another thing on a teacher's plate, on my staff's plate, in terms of making sure that we implement and implement well. Because quite frankly, I'll tell you that on most of these initiatives, we could have individual conversations about some of them, but the intent is right on. I mean, there's nothing wrong with the intent of retail. We believe our teachers have needed that kind of training for years. The implementation by the department's been slightly lacking, right? Same thing with these others, including educator evaluation. There's great stuff. There's great work for our teachers and our leaders in that new educator evaluation work, but it's very time intensive, and it comes with a cost that is not funded at the state level. So with that, and then I'll turn it over to Peter. Yes?
I didn't see under achievement gaps, and correct me, I didn't see it under the core. You address special needs kids, but I don't see what we used to call gifted and talented, we might call enrichment. I don't see that.
Yeah, it's there. I'm sorry. It's there under
It's the
Yeah, it's under high achievement for all, enrichment and challenge support. And again, one of the things we said as we did this list the other day, we actually quit at some point because we ended up moving these things around and figuring out what was included and wasn't included. I mean, we could talk about advanced placement courses there. We offer a wide array of them. There are a number of things that aren't up here that fit within those core values, but quite frankly, this is the decision-making model that goes into when we offer them.
About what percentage of the resident children go to private schools? And I don't mean special needs kids who are privately placed for different challenging reasons, but perhaps young people who are going for more challenging academic reasons or more challenging performing arts.
Well, I'm not sure why they're going.
All right.
So,
You got it. Yes,
I'm
absolutely.
not sure they're going because it's more
Absolutely.
academically challenging.
Absolutely.
But
I'll take it at that.
the
but
number,
it's-
the percentages actually dropped because the numbers remain constant while we've grown.
It's in the range is the 900 to 1,000 a year if we track it back over the last 20 years.
Okay, and that's about 12%?
Yeah,
About?
it was at 15.
Okay,
It's
all
probably
right.
dropped to the lower teens.
And that's-
the total population.
And that's smaller than the state average.
Thank you.
When you have to expand a teacher's day because of all of these mandated requirements, does that add into extra pay or shorter classroom hours or more staff or all of the above?
So because the collective bargaining agreement largely governs their day, the simple answer is it leads to more staff, right? But we do have time built into their day for collaborative time with colleagues. We actually, I'd love to tell you that on this one we planned this, but we negotiated a contract 2 years ago that took one of our professional development days and instead of setting it as a day, right, a particular day of the year, said it was a flex, right? So we could flex it. And we could offer it at different times in different ways to different people. It was a brilliant idea because along came educator evaluation. We had essentially 1 month to provide the training. And if we hadn't had that flex day, we would have had no way to do it. And we probably would have had to pay them something for it. Instead, we had already paid them for that 183rd day, and we were able to utilize it in that way. Did I answer your question?
Yeah, I think so.
Not necessarily a fiscal question. I had a question about the school calendar.
No, I'm sorry, I'm not
I
answering
know,
questions
I know
about the
you're
school
not. I think I
calendar.
know the answer to this, but it's important. I'm asking for an important reason. So how does the school calendar get set, in particular when the school starts?
Oh, look at the
And
time.
I ask like this because I guess you can answer in this way, which is as somebody, I think this is an opportunity. I think the town is very well run, and then I find these little antiquated or odd relics that you encounter as a citizen dealing with the town. And I do think as you go to talk to people about trying to do more revenue, I think trying to be able to express specifically how you can improve that experience would be helpful.
So school
good.
committee members are only laughing because they know this
I
is
know.
probably the most frustrating issue of my last year. We ended up with the calendar that we ended up with because of when certain holidays fell and because of language in the collective bargaining agreement. There are two pertinent sections of the collective bargaining agreement. One that says I can't start the school year before September 1st without the authorization of the teachers union, and the other that says I can't end the school year after June 30th. Okay? So that boxed us in a little bit with last year, which is why we ended up doing a Saturday at the Runkle School and Good Friday at the Runkle School and those kinds of things. The issue this year was we went back with a proposal to do, there's a third provision that says we have to do 2 teacher days before we can bring students in. These have been in the collective bargaining agreement forever. And so I was boxed in, right? And the box I was in when they said no to starting before September 1st was I could have made a decision to go Tuesday and Wednesday and have Thursday off and bring the kids in Friday. And again, we knew from past history that about 80 of our teachers wouldn't have been here on Friday because of the holiday. So we chose not to do that, and it was all because of the way it broke. We've already gone back. I'll just say this. I'm probably negotiating in public, but that's okay. I've already gone back and asked them, first of all, to consider for next year the 2 teacher days prior to Labor Day, even though Labor Day is very early. And second of all, we've actually asked them to consider that a permanent change, so that kids would always know they would start on the Tuesday after Labor Day. I completely agree with everything that you said about this issue. Yeah, Jim.
A couple questions. On technology, there was an element there which was entitled Contemporary Tools of Education. Can you kind of tell me give some background on the program? Is this referring to online learning? Is it learning about computers in class? Are you creating your own content? Are you purchasing content?
Yep. I'm going to ask Dr. Fisher-Mueller to address that.
The phrase contemporary tools of education means that what used to be, we hand teachers a grade book and for their class rosters and their grades, or we would hand teachers a package of chalk. Now it's about getting a laptop. Now it's about working off a smart board that has a projector mounted in the ceiling. Those are just the tools that are necessary to run school and teaching and learning as we need to in these days.
But Jim, can I just to the point, Jim, I mean, I was at a forum at the high school. I see the headmaster just came in. And we were talking about our ability to run online courses. I mean, you know that a number of high schools throughout the country have now require at least one online experience for graduation. And we're not there in terms of even being ready, although bringing the TV studio there could help us down the road with that. And so part of this vision of technology that we're working on and we're going to be able to put forward very, very shortly is really around not only the things that Dr. Fisher-Mueller talked about, but being able to do some of those more, I'll call them creative. They are here. They're not in some other places. Way of looking at coursework or support of students, including what could a one-to-one-ish initiative look like here.
Can I just ask two
Yep.
very quick questions to follow up? Just
I'm just looking at the chairs to make sure it's okay.
Is it okay? All right. So you talked about reducing the out-of-district placements, and that's much to be applauded, and I think that's really great work that you're doing there.
Thanks, Jim.
85 to 68, you said, even though you're increasing the enrollment overall. I guess if you had to think about how you could would it be cost-effective to take that down further?
Yes.
Have you thought about that? And
Yes.
Could you walk us through that?
Sure. There's some number of kids and there's some number of situations that quite frankly belong in those out-of-district placements. I mean, every time I'm in a conversation with Dr. Schmuckler, we've gone through those conversations and we pay those monies gladly. And there are other situations where we quite frankly believe we can build program. That language-based program was a great example in that if I took you through, and I won't, but if I took you through just the numbers of students who were in 7th and 8th grade, some of them in our elementary program here, and some of them already in out-of-district placements, we believe there's an opportunity to both retain and to bring students back. So yes, we do believe that there's some number out there that through building of programs in both the elementary and secondary level, that that we have some ability to reduce that number further.
Okay. I have one final question. As you know, I like to ask difficult questions, sir. So
I do know that.
yes. So administrative costs. What percentage of the school budget do you see being spent out of the administrative office? Do you see that growing? And
Well,
Yeah.
you'll see some numbers, not so much in percentages tonight. I mean, we certainly have grown the supports. If you look at a school and when you see the numbers, you'll see where we've added vice principals or we've added to our guidance, and we're looking at adding to we've clearly added to our central support for special education. Now, you can't introduce these programs and run them properly if you don't have the management staff in place. So with growth comes, the need for that management control. And I think one of the issues we're facing right now is how can we do that? Because we've tried to commit money over the years to direct service, but you reach those breakpoints. So we'll talk about some of that.
One of the current issues that were listed was elementary world language. Can you describe that? I may have missed it.
You want to talk about Howard?
Yeah, what, the program in general?
Yeah.
Sure.
So as Dr. Lupini mentioned, in 2008, part of the override was around the beginning of a K-6 elementary world language program. And that program model was the result of 2 years of research by a community committee. And it's described as a FLES model. FLES simply means foreign language in elementary schools. And the model in our schools is that it's Spanish in 7 schools and Mandarin in 1 school, the Driscoll School, which continues because they had a grant earlier. And what it is the teachers in grades K-3 are in the classrooms 3 times a week for 20 minutes, and then in grades 4 and 5, 3 times a week for 30 minutes, and a recent shift in the program is now at grade 6, 3 times a week for 45 minutes. And if you were to watch that instruction, it is very interactive, rather playful. It's not about memorizing particular words, but it's through conversation and real-life experiences that the children are not only learning the language, but also culture.
And then students choose a language as part of their 7th and 8th grade program, which could be the language that they pursued for those 6 years, 7 years, but could be another language because there are 2 offered in every elementary school. Sir, you had a question, I'm sorry.
In private industry, we often compare a company to competitors. Could you elaborate on particular strengths and weaknesses when you look at the Brookline School District versus other school districts within the Commonwealth? From a PR, public relations, public perception perspective, Brookline ranks 19th in the recent Boston Magazine out of the top 50. And I know that the formula they use may not be ideal for your computation, but I suspect that you may have evaluated other school districts that rank top. And do you have any feedback in terms of current issues, with respect to the peers?
So, 3 years ago we were number 1, or 4 years ago we were number 1, and then they changed the criteria, and that's my issue with some of that. So one I learned from a very wise school committee chair a number of years ago is that people vote with their feet, right? And so I think what's happening here, while it's not just related to the schools, says that people believe there's a quality product here. We believe there's a quality product here. Our numbers, if you looked at the MGT study, you'd see that in particular at the high school level, most high schools between 8th and 9th grade actually decline in enrollment. This one actually bumps up by something between 0.5% and 1%. We do some of that, but quite frankly, rather than, our demographics look different. A couple of years ago when we were ranked number 10, I looked at 1 through 9, and 1 through 9 didn't have a diversity profile that looked anything like this place. I think there's some value to that diversity profile. I think that's one of the reasons people want to be here. And so we try to consider all of those elements. We do playfully sort of jab with our neighbors next door in Newton, because there are certain districts that compare better to us in terms of program offered, in terms of what we're trying to achieve than other places. Some of those places, for example, choose not to do that comprehensive nature high school, right? So that's what we do. But, the opportunity to do more benchmarking in some of these areas is something we'd obviously like to do.
That's, I think, probably a huge question, and I guess maybe one way to get at it is to ask, and not to be answered today, but to just ask whether the school department has done any comparisons itself to other districts on various parameters
on various parameters, yes. On the array of parameters that you might be interested in looking at, probably not. We're not staffed for that.
You mentioned a few moments ago some of your frustrations with the collective bargaining in the form of how they may shape or constrain your ability to structure a school year. You mentioned the September 1 to June 30th as one example. Could you help us understand other aspects of that? At what time can school start? At what time could school end? Are there certain blackout periods and so forth? Just to help us get the picture of what you are required essentially to operate under?
Let me try this, and this probably will just sort of brush by your question, okay? One, and I think everybody on my staff knows this, I found when I came here the parameters around initial placement on the salary schedule to be the most draconian I had ever seen. And I've worked in a number of districts. That is, I had no flexibility in terms of where that placement might be. None. it was defined, as Dr. Allen could tell you, right down to percentages of years and where they were placed in terms of a step. And in the last negotiation, the negotiations subcommittee really did great work in creating more opportunities for placement. And so, the cry was always we wouldn't be able to secure the same quality of people if we were negotiating on initial placement. That's not true. That's not what's happened in the last 2 years. We've been able to hold closer to our mark in terms of the average salary that we bring someone in at. And yet we've been able to negotiate in more cases with people who come, for example, with out-of-state experience, who come with experience that they had where they weren't licensed. Okay, those used to be, they counted. Now it's negotiable between me and the candidate as to whether they count, right? So, but that was as anybody on the negotiating team can tell you, that was a big issue in our discussions in terms of making that work, and a huge topic of negotiation, and took hours and hours. So every one of these, and sure I could name others, but to do work on those in the negotiation process is quite an undertaking.
What about
I
just,
think your co-chairs want to ask the committee, do we want to keep going on this line? We're noting that we're on page.
No, on slide 3, that's
Yeah, I
pretty
think
good.
we're on slide, I think we're on 5.
It's better than I usually do. So.
5 of 65, although John Adams is quoted towards the end, so maybe there's some filler in there.
I'm not going to skip that one.
Oh, sorry, okay. That was the most important one, okay. Just sense of the committee, sort of keep going on this, which is fascinating and interesting to me, or move on to the data.
Is it, I mean, an alternative to continuing on would be for people to funnel questions to you, which could be sent on and we could get follow-up, or is
Yeah,
it
I
really
think,
sort of a?
just to preview the next piece of this, which is that we do, after tonight, there's 2 paths. Either we finish this tonight or we don't. If we were so lucky as to finish this tonight, which we may not be. The idea was that we would ask each of you to send the questions from Sean's presentation and tonight's presentations that have been bubbling in your mind, try to categorize them or just get them down on paper, send them to Dick and I by the end of the week. The 2 of us would try to sort through and say, maybe we need more presentations, maybe we need to do something else, we need to break into subcommittees, whatever it is. We would try to do some of that thinking, bring it back to you all, and you all could make some determinations about what we do with those questions. So I think that's the answer to what happens after tonight. I mean, clearly, if we don't get through this, we don't get through it, and we can do the rest of this. We can just have it longer on the 9th. I guess I wouldn't want to go past the 9th and skip 1 or 2 weeks without getting to the questions, though.
Yeah, I think, given that we are on page 3 of 33 now, and we're halfway through the meeting, I think we're likely to go into another day with this, into our next meeting. I think cutting out questions now is not going to allow you to finish tonight anyway.
Just one comment. There was a method to my madness in the questions that I asked, which was I was looking for places, I guess I was pushing to see how solid the decision of the school committee was, and Dr. Lupini on some things, but Medco, special needs, enrichment program, early childhood, those are space issues, and so that's kind of what I was thinking. Maybe and I'm certainly willing to make a note on what I think my questions are aimed at, and maybe we can categorize some of that,
So I guess all I
even
would
as
say
individuals.
is, maybe what we say is, ask the questions you'd like to ask, recognizing that this isn't the only time you will see Dr. Lupini
Absolutely.
before the end of the process. Okay.
Where are we in the collective bargaining cycle?
We're at the end of the collective bargaining agreement this year. As Mr. Cronin, I think, said last week, we have a tail. I think Peter's going to talk about that. We have a tail on the end of that, but we have no collective bargaining agreement for 14-15.
Which means when you'll start negotiating?
Well, it means generally we start when we receive a request from the BEU. Generally speaking, that comes in January.
Okay.
Ish.
I see. Okay, gotcha. Thank you.
Mr. Rowe.
Thank you. So what you've been talking about is really the substance of what we do, our core values, our programs, et cetera. So I want to take a few minutes, and by the way, since I control the clicker, we will finish the slideshow now. we won't answer all your questions, obviously. And part of what we're really trying to do is to whet your appetite in terms of those pieces of information you think you need in order to feel comfortable that you really understand our organization and what we do. So that's really the goal. First slide here, and I'm not going into detail on it, but it's just to show you graphically how we're organized with, starting from this side, the Teaching and Learning Office, and then we have, I can't even read it. I got to put my glasses on.
Headmaster and principal.
Oh, yes, the headmaster and the principals. Reporting directly to the superintendent, we have teaching and learning, the headmaster and the principals, our human resource office, our student service office, and administration and finance.
And student service is?
It includes special education guidance. You'll see the detail, and you can, for reference, see all of these issues. I want to give you a brief history on two items. One is Proposition 2.5, and the other is education reform, because Sean mentioned Proposition 2.5 last week. And it's significant in terms of the way it controls the resources that are available to local communities for their largest and most significant area of revenue raising, which is the property tax. Proposition 2.5 didn't exist always. It happened in 1981 as an initiative petition. It was modeled very much like what happened in California in Proposition 13. Prior to Proposition 2.5, school committees had fiscal autonomy, and what that meant was they would set their budget each year, they'd present it to the municipality, and the municipality would have to fund it. This led to a taxpayer revolt, essentially, because what property tax bills were going up and up, and folks were finding themselves in a situation where they were seeing this percentage growth, and it led to control of the property tax. We'll see as we look at the issues of ed reform, which controls and directs state money to local education, that Brookline, because of its situation as a wealthy community in Massachusetts, actually is controlled as the amount of state revenue we get. So we have control on our property tax, which is our major source of revenue, and we have control of state revenue that would be a potential for us. So that's what you'll see is really why the constraints of this have come together. Just to go quickly, the education reform grew out of the initiatives that said that there were major barriers to effective education for advantaged and disadvantaged students because of their place of birth. Meaning if you were born in Brockton as opposed to Brookline, you didn't get as good a quality education because Brookline had the resources to fund your the quality education. And so the McDuffie versus Robertson eventually became a case that went to court, and the argument was that McDuffie, the student in Brockton, couldn't get the advantage of students who were born in Brookline, Concord, or Wellesley. And so the outcome of this was a negotiated agreement under Governor Weld at the time in '93, working with the legislature, that led to ed reform, and it set foundation budgets and required net spending, and essentially was upheld in what became known as the Hancock case, that said that over the period from '93 through really the end of the '90s, which were good financial years, when the state was able to fund the 7-year challenge it had put in front of itself in terms of foundation budgets, that it was a commitment where the state had met its obligations in trying at least to address the needs of the less wealthy communities in Massachusetts. The other pieces that I think are not as well recalled, if you will, is that education reform also made significant changes on a number of issues because the quid pro quo for the additional revenue from the state was accountability for public school systems. One of the changes was that it instituted the strong executive, so that the superintendent today and principals are the people who hire and hold accountable staff. Prior to ed reform, all personnel issues were approved by school committees. If you look at issues so now we have authority resting in an executive, a strong executive. If you look at the state level, the Board of Education, which some would argue was a rubber stamp prior to education reform, now is a very strong organization with strong authority over school systems. In education personnel, prior to ed reform, once you got your license or your certification, you had it for life. Teachers now have to be recertified. First certified, they have to be tested, they have to be certified. Every 5 years, you have to be recertified. There's a process similar to what you find in other professions. And then in terms of the accountability measures, the idea was to, from the state at least, was to introduce some market forces into the educational realm, public education, with accountability around testing, curriculum frameworks, evaluations of schools. So the MCAS became the test, and as Bill pointed out, that could be replaced as as we're looking down the road at things in front of us. But education reform also created charter schools as competition for public schools. School choice was allowed prior to ed reform. You could apply as a citizen in one community to pay tuition and send your kid to the local school system. So in Brookline, there were Boston students who paid tuition to come here. The school system would set a certain number of seats every year. That went away because under ed reform, the idea is that the community has to pay, and every family, families because of their wealth don't have the opportunity to choose school systems. So that if you're a school system that participates in school choice, your state funding gets reduced and sent to the receiving community if you're accepted into a neighboring community. So if you look at communities like Avon and Brockton, which border each other, and Avon participates in school choice, the number of Brockton students that they take, Brockton loses some of its state funding each year for the number of students. So the idea of competition and market forces in education, all of that was new, and all of that came with education reform. So if we look at this slide, what we see is that somewhere between, right about 40% of, you look at the trailing funding for local education, you would think that you'd find somewhere in the 30 to 40% of the cost of Brookline education would come from the state, because that's the state average. In fact, if you look at the graph, what you see is, and these are documents that are available through the Department of Education's website. What you'll see is that the red stack here is the funding level that Brookline gets from the state for what's called Chapter 70, which is education funding. And this is actually our spending level. The crosshatch stack here is what's called the foundation budget. We get a percentage of foundation budget. The formula puts Brockton in this situation, where the preponderance of funding, because of the calculation of the wealth of the community based on property values, based on income values, is that, as you see, probably 80% of the cost of education in Brockton is funded by the state. And so this model is true, where if you look at Wellesley and Weston and Newton and Brookline, you see a model that looks like this. If you look at Chelsea and Springfield and Lawrence and Lowell, and you'll see a model that looks like this. So that what's happened in that distribution of the revenue is that it's not that school systems get 30 to 40% of the revenue from the state. It's that depending on the wealth of the community, the revenue from the state gets driven in different directions. Now let's look a little. Let's look a little bit at Brookline itself. Our total budget, our total resources that we get, school and town, for the current year we just started, are in the $133 million range. That's a number that I think Sean referenced at his presentation last week. But what you'll see is that our general fund, as we talk about it, is an $86 million number. And then we have grant funds, we have revolving funds, and so that the total school budget, what we call our operating budget, is $98 million. And you see this broken down here. This is our $98 million. We have, in addition to our general fund that has some sources of revenue, the major one being the town appropriation from the property tax, we have some grant funds and we have some revolving funds, which are generally enterprise funds. The number that you saw there from the town in support of schools is $35 million, is broken down. We are, like all Massachusetts local educational agencies, local city or town, we're a dependent school system. And depending on the model and the size of the community, different communities structure services differently. We very much are, receive services, either what you might say contract for service, or we work with the town for services across a number of areas, where in other communities you might find that there are separate organizations in the schools. So administrative services, this would be the services from legal counsel, from finance, from purchasing, from human resources, from healthcare management, those kinds of supports. Utility services and building and ground services. The town's building department is our building department. We work with them in terms of procurement of energy services, et cetera. We contract with the town and with the DPW for grounds, so that the town's services for grounds and parks and recreation fields are the same for school fields and parks. Benefits are managed by the town's human resource department. And finally, this carries a share of long-term principal and interest, so that when we try and talk about all sources, it's laid out here.
It would be helpful for folks to understand which pieces of this essentially town meeting controls, which pieces the school committee controls.
Sure. The town meeting controls the general, town meeting controls the general fund appropriation. And the school department controls the remainder here of these funds. And town meeting has full control of these dollars because they're budgeted to town departments.
Town meeting, just to be clear,
Yeah.
town meeting controls the gross amount.
That's correct,
but not
yes.
the
right.
allocation
The-
within that.
Right, unlike other departments, town meeting has no say in how the school committee goes about spending the dollars that are appropriated for schools. That's under the authority of the school committee.
And that number's on the other page, that's the 87,
Yeah, that's this-
82 point.
Exactly, that's
Does
this number
everybody
right
get
here.
that? That's actually an important point. Okay.
Peter,
Yeah.
what is a circuit breaker?
Circuit breaker is state funding we receive for high-cost special needs students. That does come directly to us into a revolving fund. So each of these, I can go through these quickly. So to the extent that we can charge tuition for materials fee, et cetera, we do raise some revenue that we use to support the general fund. We do some facility rental. Circuit breaker is state revenue for high-cost students. And revolving fund reimbursement in this case, it's a contribution for health insurance from some of our revolving funds. Let me just go through some of the breakout here. So when you look at our general fund, which is $86 million, circuit breaker is one piece that if you will, comes directly to the schools, and then those other sources are here. But when you look at the remainder of this, which is really the $82 million, all of that comes from the town's appropriation. The reason that we have this Chapter 70 is the name of state aid that comes to the community for education in the state's formula that distinguishes those red bars between Brookline and the Brocktons of the world. That's the money they say we're getting for education. That goes into the town's general fund, and revenue gets distributed. It's not that we get all of the Chapter 70, but we're representing it here because that's where it goes. It goes into the town's general fund, and then through the process that Sean described a week ago, where we then divide up revenue through the town-school partnership. So it's used to support our total general fund revenue. If you look at our...
So as the state has essentially continue to increase Chapter 70, but decrease other non-school related local aid. The town school split is just sort of on the gross, so the town's indifferent as to how the money's actually allocated by the state. Is that right?
You're correct. You're correct. We essentially look at total state aid when it comes in and hope that it's grown in some area. You're right. And the last couple of years, it's actually grown in Chapter 70, which I'll talk about later due to an anomaly and a change that happened in 2007, which may give us a little bit of opportunity in the next couple of years. Yeah.
All federal money goes through the state first, right? So
Most of it, yeah.
that includes
All of
Title
it.
I and everything?
Yes, we'll look at that in just a second. So we're still in general fund here. So in terms of how it's distributed, now this is what are the uses, those are the sources. Uses are what we describe as curriculum instruction, about 48%, extracurriculars, small amount, student services, which is special education, guidance, medical, psychological, about 32%, support services, meaning supervision, transportation, et cetera, in the 17% range, and administration, 2%, what we call directly from Jim's question from earlier. And then expense by type, as you see, we are a personnel, as you would imagine, personnel-driven organization. And this is even more dramatic in our operating budget because of the issues of energies budgeted over in the building department, building services are over here. So most of those capital costs that are actually, you would, in an organization our size, that you might see are actually carried on the town side budget in those operating departments that we work with for those services. Now on the grants, yes, to your question. The Massachusetts Department of Elementary and Secondary Education actually processes federal funds, and we receive that money from them. So the what we call Individuals with Disability, which is a special education federal grant, Title I, Title II, et cetera. These come from the Department of Education. But our grants are $5.4 million. So what you see is that grants really are a supplement. So they come usually targeted for a particular purpose, and they supplement the core services that we're required to provide from the general fund. There are some state grants, METCO, kindergarten, and some early childhood programs are the largest of those. And then we receive some private grants. This is generally the Brookline Foundation or the 21st Century Fund. And then there's some other competitive grants. These grants that come to us from the federal government are generally allocation grants that we receive, and then we do get the opportunity to apply for some competitive grants. Our revolving funds, the three major areas where we can raise money, these are enterprise funds basically. Adult education, and we run a program that raises just under $1.4 million. Our school food service program, which is the largest of these. And then the early education program. And the question earlier was in charging tuition for early education. In round numbers of the just under 300 students, approximately 100 of them are students with special needs who we do not charge. The other 200 are what we call the typically developing students who we do charge. And so that generates that $2 million worth of revenue that goes into the revolving fund. When you look at our staff, what you'll see is that we are a staff of 1,174 for FY14. And if you look at the division, we show 317 positions in what we call instruction. And instruction to us in this category is subject area teachers, 7th grade and up. So it would be our high school staff and our teachers at the 7th and 8th grade where we staff by subject, as well as the support staff and related services for instruction. Kindergarten and elementary is the total staff for our K through 6 generally. We're in a mode right now where we do some differentiation and have some subject area staff for some of our 6th grades, but it's generally K through 6, so that's this number here, the 228. Our administration and support, we have 33 positions, as you see here. Our other support, 136, and mandated, which is virtually exclusively our special education program and our English language learner program, is 309 positions proposed for and budgeted for FY14. This graph shows you those 5 categories across the years. It's every year from 1998, I think, forward, but it skips a couple of years in the early years. And what you see is that the major growth was in the mandated services. And we've seen in the last few years significant growth in the area that's our kindergarten and elementary. And we expect that we'll see growth in our instructional area beyond what we've seen here as we see enrollment growth at the high school, which I'll get into in a couple of minutes.
Peter,
yeah.
what positions are captured within support?
If you look right here, let me go back here. So there's actually 2 categories of support here. So let me, down here is a support number. And this, by the way, is available in the budget. So what you'll see is we also have what we call school-based support here. So there are, if you read across here, you'll see that we have our Psychological services, our medical service, and our guidance services are the major ones here, distributed high school, elementary, and central. And those really make up the largest numbers of our support staff, as we categorize them this way. What you can do here is you can look at the distribution across our academic areas, so that if we look up to this area, which is instruction, you can then look at the distribution. So for instance, you'll see that we have 19.4 positions which are high school world language positions, and 14.2 that are elementary world language positions. And you can do that by reading across for each of our various programs within the broad category. So the prior page is the broad category, and then this is the detail for the general fund, where you'll see we have 24 positions. And then the next page, which this is a two-page document in the budget document, you'll see the remaining 150 positions that are funded on our grants. And again, you can read down this column here to see whether it's kindergarten or IDEA or Title I, and then see the distribution across the organization. So this is an attempt to give you the flavor of how our positions are distributed.
Could I ask just a quick question? What's the percentage of special needs students in Brookline Public Schools?
I'll show you that number later. I think it's 16.5% K through 12, 18% for all services, meaning pre-K, services only, and out of district, along with K through 12, is in the 18% range.
And that trend line is going up rather quickly to the point where you have about, 285 positions that are special needs related, I think, from that slide, and you have 319 teachers in other sort of areas.
What you'll see is that the trend line actually for our student count has percentage-wise, has been stable over the last 4 years. We're hopeful it'll remain that way. The trend line for the staffing, as you say, has, yes, gone up. There's one anomaly here, if we go back to this period of time. A lot of the growth has been in classroom aides, and if we go back to the early 90s, they were categorized as hourly positions, and we started to count them as full-time equivalents in this year here. So the true growth is in here. Most of the position, the preponderance, and I didn't provide you with this tonight, but we could, of the growth has been in classroom aides. However, yes, we've had a significant growth in the professionals who work in our special education department, be they classroom teachers or occupational therapists, speech therapists, et cetera, those professionals who provide related service. Sure.
Yeah, except it's exactly what we said earlier. Both those aide positions and those and some percentage, pretty good percentage of the increase in staffing is related to building programs, which is how you retain kids in the district.
So let me move from staffing quickly to budget. I just want, excuse me, this is enrollment, not budget. To enrollment, to show you some of the issues that have really affected us, the major issue that's really challenged us over the last few years. And this compares our enrollment, which began to turn around in 05 and 06, to the current day. And what you see is that in the last, in this 8-year period, we've grown by 1,300 students. Where's the number here? We've grown by 1,336 students at the K-8 level, really distributed across all our schools. The most dramatic, 231 additional students at Pierce, 221 additional students at Lawrence, but no one has been spared as we've experienced this growth. And what's interesting about this and what's challenging about this is when you look at the distribution, because the red stack are the current enrollments at Brookline High School, and then the green, purple, and yellow are the current enrollments at grades K through 8. And what you see is that for the last X years, 5, essentially, we've been bringing in 600 to 600 plus students a year. We have one class here that wasn't. And graduating in the low 400s. And so we're growing that 150 plus students every year. I described it to someone as it's not a ball moving through the belly of a snake, it's like a telephone pole. Because what we see is the stretch that started 5 years ago, we really started before that, you see growth in here, is continuing. And so each year as we graduate these lower numbers, we're bringing in more kids. So we currently have 660 more students at the lower 4 grades than we have at the upper 4 grades. And so, yeah,
Just wondering, what's the historical high enrollment?
I'm glad you asked. I'll get to that in a second, okay? Yeah. Now, this slide shows our average class size during this period of time. And the difference is, we wanted to give some historical perspective. We'd been tracking this, excluding our substantially separate students. And because of the point Bill was making about the goal of having integrated classrooms, we began back in 2002 to track this based on every student who's included. So that what you see is that we've struggled over the last few years as our enrollment has grown to maintain a quality class size. And we have grown about 1.5 students. I know Bill mentioned half a student earlier. I think he meant to say 1.5. During that, that's okay. During that period of time, we've grown by 1.5. And to show you how those students are distributed, this shows you the difference between '05 and current year in terms of the frequency of class size. So for instance, there were 8 situations, 8 classrooms at the K-8 level in '05 that had 23 students in them. Today we have 50. We have 51 classes with 22 students. So we still have a favorable class size, but it's nothing like what it was before the growth began to occur. Yes.
I'm going to just spend 1 second. I mean, school committee policy technically has a difference between younger grades and middle grades, and so can you just explain that?
Yes, the goal is to have 22 at K3 and up to 25 at the other grades, the K4 through 8. And we actually find this year that we have a slightly better class size average at K3 than we do at 4-8, although the last 2 years we struggled with that. And it had to do with the fact that the population was incoming at the low end.
And I remember there's a lot more on this enrollment thing in the B-Space report if people want it.
Right, absolutely. This is 50 years worth of data on, to Carol's question about enrollment, using 1960 as the base. This tracks how we've moved up and down for elementary, high school, and then total. And this is the current year, FY14. And so what you see is that our total enrollment is actually just about the same number as it was back in, what year is that? 1970. In other words, we're at our prior peak in 1970 is a number we've reached in total. What's interesting is within the mix of, or what's scary is within the mix of that, this is what our elementary enrollment is. And this is what our high school enrollment is. In other words, our high school enrollment is down. And so we're expecting that those students are going to be moving forward. And so we're expecting that this graph, which graphs out to the next few years, will continue.
Has
So
the
that's
definition of elementary remained constant throughout this period?
I'm sorry, say
Has the
again?
definition of elementary remained
Yes,
constant?
we've been K-8 the whole time. What is different probably is kindergarten, which was, prior to 10 years ago, was a half day. We went to full-day kindergarten 10 years ago. And so as you go farther back, I actually found some numbers from, I want to say it's 51, 52, and 53. Oh, no, this isn't the kindergarten. Where's the kindergarten grade? Let me just show you this number, and then I'll digress. This is the enrollment of the kindergarten classes during essentially the same period of time. And what you see is that we had some numbers, some classes that had more than 500 students back in the 1960s, right? And then we dropped during this period, and now we've grown up to here. This is actually last year. This graph was done for B-Space before we had our FY, our current year, where actually our enrollment's 628 at kindergarten, which is right up in here. I actually found some numbers from, I think it's 51, 52, and 53, which were which were 600, let's say there were 650 students. In other words, they were at or where we are today. Those were the baby boom kids, right, who were born in 46, 47, 48, right after the war. But 2 years later, those classes had dropped below 600. I can't explain why. So, what exactly was going on? So when we look back at the size of our classes during this entire period, we can't find, except for those 3 years, any class that was over 600. And now we have 4 of our elementary, of our first, is it 5? 4 of the first 5.
4 of the last 5.
Yeah, are over 600. Yes, Chad?
Yes, if I look at them, I mean, I know you mentioned that the B-Space graph was done before you had this year's data.
Yeah.
But, you know, we noticed you've got basically a flat line out, and
Oh,
I'm
that's
assuming.
just because we said, oh, what if we have 600 over there?
Right, but I guess the question I have, and is it fair to assume that when we look at kindergarten enrollments more than sort of the next year out, when we're starting to collect data, we really have no basis to know whether they're going to continue to go up, drop?
Well, here's what we have. Let me show you the next couple of slides. So we used to look at our enrollment during this period of time. This goes back up until 2003, essentially. And we were getting a yield, if we looked at the birth data and looked at how it corresponded to the 5 years later, we would get 70, 72% of the kids each year. And it was pretty predictable. You can see it right along here. And then beginning in 2005, something began to happen. And this is how the numbers have played out corresponding to the birth cohort during that period of time. In other words, it got narrower and narrower, the gap between the two. Till last year, we brought in 666 kindergartens on a birth cohort of 667. In other words, we hit 100%. And there's no ceiling to this because clearly it's not births that are driving our enrollment. It's something else. And later on, there's some data in here on housing, and you'll see condo conversions and other, we believe it's people moving to the community, not necessarily being born here, that are driving this. So there's been a real anomaly over the last 7-8 years that we believe is driving this. Tim, yeah.
Just a couple slides back where you're showing the enrollment in the high school. I was kind of curious, how big was the high school in 65 or whatever, and then,
Yeah.
because even in the mid-'80s,
It was higher than 2000, yeah.
I just want to get a sense for that. And
I can get you the numbers. I don't have them in here. Yes, it was bigger. And that's one of the things we're studying with this question of what's the capacity of the high school? Because you'll see from these numbers, we're projecting, and I think it's right down here, we're projecting the high school is going to go to 2,500 kids by 2020. This is the current year, okay? We've been in a, if you will, honeymoon period. We're about to see this growth over the next 8 years or so. And
2022 are this year's what year?
and the reason this is here is because 2022 is this year's K through 3 cohort. And we'll get to that in a second as to why we believe they'll be there. But anyway, just taking let me finish Chad's question. So if you look at the out years in terms of the birth data we have, these 4 years here, and then you go and you graph what our yield has been. In other words, what we had 100% here, we have about 95% this year. If you say, okay, if you look at the 10-year average, the 5-year average, the 3-year average, depending on what you choose, the 3-year average says that we would have, 640, 640, 640. So depending on what we want to believe, we believe that the number is going to be no lower than 600. We started this year's budget by saying it'll be 600. We got 628. The numbers look very much like this, so that, depending on what else is going on in the community, it's not just a birth number. We believe we'll have a minimum 600 students, at least for the next foreseeable future.
Yeah, so I don't disagree with your conclusion.
Yeah.
I guess my thought would be if you've looked at the data, and I think you're quite correct that chart suggests that birth rates are not really what's driving your enrollment, that it's people moving into the community, then I'm not sure how relevant it is to take it based on birth 3 or 5 year or 10-year average.
What happens to kids K through 12, I think.
Okay, well, there's two other things to look at. So if this is a question, we also looked at the cohort survival, okay? And so what we did was we graphed the graduating classes from 2002 through 2017.
So as we're snickering at the word cohort survival,
Yes.
Okay.
It means students who remained in the system,
Thank
right?
you.
So if you look at the first grade, if you look at the enrollment in first grade, and then you look at how that group of kids moved through the system, right? and where they were at the end, and then just average that whole group. What you see is that 10th grade, we essentially have 100%. And at no year do we go lower than 95%. So this makes us believe that if we look at our first grade population, we can be pretty predictive of where our enrollment will be across the years.
Sure, no, that I totally agree with. I think, looking at your current, basically looking at my kids and assuming they're going to graduate on a larger scale.
Right. People stay here once they come generally, yeah.
Is one question, but then the separate question is what is our confidence level on projections for incoming kindergarten classes? And I'm not trying to be critical because it
No.
sounds like it's probably a very hard thing to estimate, but it sounds like the answer to that is fairly low because we're sort of estimating
Right.
off of stuff that's changing very rapidly.
Because it appears that the factors have a lot more to do with available housing and people's willingness to choose, let's say, a 2-bedroom or a 3-bedroom condo, as opposed to what we might used to have believed they'd buy a single-family home. Because there hasn't been a lot of single-family home development, there has been a lot of condo development, and we certainly know anecdotes of people with 2 kids in a 2-bedroom condo. So we do have data on numbers of condominiums and how they match, let's say, the Lawrence neighborhood, and it's at the end of this presentation. And so you can see some of that, and it's very different from what the housing stock looked like a decade ago. And one of the conversations that came out of the B-Space study was, it's not really the housing changes that have happened in the last decade, but it was a decade before that, after rent control went away and after people then began to do condo conversions. It really, I think, developed a lot of the capacity that's now being utilized by folks who are moving to this community to take advantage of the school system. Yeah.
Let me just say, Chet, so you're right. I mean, and that's why you see us using that model to make predictions. We're basing it on what happened before the growth started, what's happened since, and we're making a range of predictions that we then use to build a budget. So we're making that kind of guess. The other thing, I just want to correct one thing that Mr. Rowe said, and that is when people come, they don't necessarily stay. Their numbers stay.
Sure.
Right? So this is a really key point in this district. So we did a presentation for the school committee a number of years ago on MCAS scores, and we were looking at 3rd grade and 8th grade. And one of the first things our data analyst at the time said is that only 60% of the faces remain the same. And the school committee found that interesting. So we went back and looked at it in 2 other years and found that in those 2 other years, I think it was 55 and 57%. Now, at some schools, that's close to 100%. And at other schools, it's significantly under 50%. But on average, while the numbers remain the same, there it is, the faces that are sitting in those seats change about 40% between 3rd and 8th grade, much larger percentages in some schools.
Looked at in another way, the DOE has numbers, they report attrition and they report churn. And those numbers were both picked up in a recent paper that Linda Pelkey and Larry Koff did. And the attrition, which is the percentage of kids leaving the system between the end of one school year and the beginning of the next school year, I think is about 8% in Brookline across the system. The churn, which is kids moving either out of the system or I think also within the school, from one school to another, is also about 8% system-wide. So concealed within that 97% figure is a lot of movement within the schools. And in addition to that, you're following up, Chad, on your point about looking at the birth rate. That paper indicated that I think about 30% of the kids coming into the schools are coming from other countries. And the presumption was, I think the new ones coming in, I may have that figure wrong, but you're talking a lot of postdoctorate parents, being drawn here for short periods of time by the academic and medical institutions around.
Right. And we were, Tim, just before you ask the question, this is the census data comparing 2000 and 2010. And actually, when we got it in 2010, we kind of said, oh, so that's what's going on. you notice that from age 9 and younger, the citizens of Brookline grew by 1,070. So during that period of time, our elementary schools grew by about 1,000 kids, right? So we said, oh, well, of course, there's the answer. We weren't completely crazy. It didn't come from the birth rate. But if you look at, but what had been going on was we were talking about the fact that the citizenry of Brookline didn't grow very much during that period of time. It was masking the fact that we're having this significant growth in our younger students and in those 60 and older, but that's a different. We don't have to educate them.
Peter, this is, I
Yeah,
think you're talking this, but so I mean, to some degree, perhaps from a enrollment perspective, we're lucky that the surge is happening at kindergarten and staying, not necessarily happening at other. So it seems like people are coming in droves at the kindergarten level and staying there, as opposed to having people move in big numbers in
Randomly?
third, fourth, fifth grade. Because are you seeing growth from this? You know, is the 3-year-old first grade class now much bigger in fourth grade, or is it staying?
We usually see growth from K to 1.
Yes.
You know, I'm not sure that the variability has been as great in the last couple of years as it might have been in the past, but once we went to full-day kindergarten, I think that narrowed. But there's always growth there, and then we also see growth from 8 to 12. Folks who send their kids to private school for the middle school years often send them back to Brookline High School. So there's generally that jump from 8 to 9. So you're right, there's lots of movement of you know, who's enrolled, this issue of churn and attrition, but we have this really strong cohort survival number.
I was wondering, do we have data on,
Can you get a microphone?
is there data on who the parents work for? I'm particularly interested in those organizations from which we negotiate pilot payments, what demands their employees are putting on the system, and how much of the student growth is coming from expansions of their
The answer is
programs.
no, we don't have that data.
Can we get it, though? Is that something that can be generated in any
I
way,
don't-
or can it be asked?
Whether there could be some kind of town-wide initiative out of the planning department to, you know, or whether we would initiate something around that, but we never have. And it would be unusual, I suppose, and I'm not sure that anybody's required to tell us, but we could voluntarily ask. But the answer is no, we don't currently keep that data.
Speaking, it's Boston University, they're the only
Right.
significant pilot.
And I'm just wondering, do we know what percentage of their employees?
Yeah, I don't think we have.
To follow up on the chairman's comment about the Pelkey report, they also suggested that there was very good cohort data on the ages of 0 to 4, which are publicly available annually, and which suggested to me that it would be useful as a predictor for you, rather than only getting the actual enrollment at kindergarten, that you might be able to look back at the 2, 3, and 4-year-olds and actually get a better sense of what's coming. Are you aware of that public data?
You're talking about of
0 to 4-year-old public data that you can look at on an annual basis
citizens?
here
Yeah.
in Brookline?
I know the birth data.
No, this is additional information. We'll get that to you.
That'd be great. So that you can provide us with the number of citizens, age 2, age 3, age 1, et cetera? That's great, yeah. No, we have not had that in the past.
We know this is
Yeah.
part of a national trend. The millennials, you know, it seems to be that young people, people under 40, are willing to live in smaller space, are becoming more urban, they want to walk. We see all this. Have you hired someone? Do you know of another town or city that is tracking some of this and doing it well? I don't know, a Webster Grove or a Greenwich,
Yeah.
Connecticut, that you might want to look at this so you can make a more hard data prediction? Is there a community out there that is a little further along this curve? Because, you know, thinking of, you know, San Francisco, Chicago, this is happening in a lot of places. I don't know how solid it's happening.
Yeah, yeah.
But,
We haven't. We hired a national company, MGT, to do our facilities long-range study. But we haven't brought in anyone who studied the demographics of, let's say, you know, a community near an urban area. Yeah.
about that.
yeah.
Is there anything out there that's, you know, that's taking a look at that? I mean, Gwyneth Paltrow is staying in the city and rearing apple there. I mean, I know these things,
That's
and
good to know.
so there are
We'll do a
lots of,
listserv
there are a
for
lot
that.
of young people sort of nationally doing this, and it seems to be part of the reflection. The status symbols are a little different than your tractor lawnmower.
Yeah, no, it's an
So-
interesting question. I would also ask, I'm not sure if this committee got the MGT report. Did we send? did we
No, I'm not sure you did. We sent it to the B-Space.
So why don't we, there are a couple things we're going to send around as follow-ups, so let's make sure we send those as well, just so people have it.
Yeah,
Because
I think
it
it is.
answers part of your question, but not entirely.
Yeah, so to many of these questions, which is there better data that we could have that would help to inform what's going on? The answer is there absolutely, hopefully there is. We're not, we don't know what it'll tell us, but we're pretty confident that it will tell us that the models and some of the projections you're seeing here will resemble what they'll tell us as well. We can't go beyond another 4 years or so, and it would be interesting if we could. So there's nothing here that indicates to us that this pattern is going to drop anytime soon. In fact, I'm sorry, yeah.
I just want to know, how do you define the birth rate? Is it birth?
Oh, it's reported to the Department of Public Health. So both the town clerk and Department of Public Health, it's children who are born to residents of Brookline.
Right. I just want
Parents who have a residence in Brookline when their child is born, regardless, so if they're born at the Brigham and Women's, which is in Boston, they're considered a Brookline birth, yes.
Just a parenthetical comment. The MGT report is actually a hot link inside the B-Space report that this committee received.
Can we just go back for 1 second?
Sure.
Just
Yeah.
one place that there's some information, I think, is, there's the housing stock question, which I know you'll get to and we'll dig into. But it's very interesting that as you see neighborhoods change, right, and people move out of the neighborhood and younger families move in, and that's a generation which I think you can see on your enrollment from the 1960s and how those cycles work. But I think what's really interesting about this data is the number of people in the 55 to 69 range, which means there's a lot of room for people to move out and others to move
Over
in.
the next few years.
Correct.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's absolutely right, right. And that's kind of, if you look at the age cohorts, I think that this matches pretty well. The other thing that's interesting in here, which was something that came out of the MGT study when they looked at this, is they were actually saying, we're not so sure that your enrollment's going to continue to grow because your cohort that has women of childbirth age is actually dropping. So that was one of the factors they used in saying, well, maybe we'll temper the projection a little. I think that's been overwhelmed by the families moving in, is at least my characterization. Excuse me. The point of this is to show that whatever that incoming kindergarten number looks like, if we were to have a dramatic back-off to only 540 kindergartners a year, I say only because it's now well over 600, this is what the enrollment at our K-8s would look like over the next 6 years. So that we don't expect that to happen. We expect the number to be much closer to 600, which is that we're going to grow probably another 300-ish students if we bring in 600 and be somewhere in the 5,400 to 5,500 total population at the K-8 schools, and that's why the recommendations that came out of the B-Space committee are such, to try to accommodate that population. So let me pause for a minute and just talk about the structure of our budget and some of the projections that we're doing for the next 5 years. We generally, when we put our budget together, talk about the current year and the 5 years to come. And the key factors that we try to identify are what are those areas of significance that are pushing our spending forward. And that's really this group in here, where we quantify, and these are incremental changes annually. So historically, we have seen that our special education total cost moves in a range that's gone somewhere from 500 to 700,000. This past year, our budget, we grew special education by 500,000. Another area of our budget that's part of collective bargaining are step increases, where when we look at the grid, and I can show it to you a little later, there's an annual cost of teachers as they move one year to another on the classic teacher salary grid. And that cost us net about $750,000 a year. We were able to make some program improvements, some advances in our literacy program, as an example of the kinds of areas where we tried to fund. We made some provision for some loss of grants where we didn't want to lose the program. We had collective bargaining agreements that cost us just under $2.3 million. We had to fund enrollment growth of just under $700,000. And we had other actions in the budget that were about $400,000. So that what you see is that the pressure on our budget was just over $5 million. And this was in a framework of a year that at the end of the day was a significant increase to our budget. 4.5%, $4 million, which was one of the highest numbers that we've actually experienced if you look over the last few years. But to get there, we had to make some reductions and some both efficiencies, restructuring. We cut some positions in various areas and consolidated some programs, and we were fortunate to have accrued some savings within some restructuring we did in special education. So we essentially made this budget, although we also brought $350,000 to the table from a fund balance in the circuit breaker program that helped us save some of our enrichment and challenge support program and some of our music program, which had initially been on the table for being reduced. But as we look forward, what you see is that we're facing somewhere, if we were to come to collective bargaining agreements that had 1% as the salary increase over the next 5 years, we're in a situation where we need 3 to 4 million, essentially $4 million a year, in order to not have to cut services. And this is without making any significant increases programmatically, advances programmatically, if you will. This is just an attempt to fund what we believe will be a pattern of special ed, although you notice this number is higher than what it was the current year, and enrollment growth that may actually be lower than what we're going to be talking about as we get into some details on some numbers with you. So that it's really saying we continue to have a challenge as we look ahead. Yeah.
Well, you've got a ninth school, but it only shows up 1 year, and I'm not sure I understand that.
I'll tell you why that's there. Again, this is from work we were doing with the B-Space group as we were studying what would the cost be for the administration and support if we were to open a ninth elementary school.
But why is it just one time?
Because what we're saying is these are incremental costs. It would be a new cost in FY16 if we opened a school that year. We would then continue to pay it every year, but it wouldn't be incrementally new to be set off against new revenues. So what this is saying is every year if we're going to grow by a new 4 million, we're going to need a new 4 million of revenue in our base to support it.
And do you, when you see numbers like this, start to look now at potential reductions when you're doing your 5-year planning?
Yes. Well, we begin to talk about what are the issues that we're going to have to face if our enrollment isn't going to drop, right? And if our special education costs aren't going to plateau or drop. The only other significant piece in this is collective bargaining. What realistically in the marketplace are we going to have to come to agreement on? So that those really are the big moving parts in this. What actions are we going to have to take in order to make a budget? Because while this number here at 2 million may be lower than where we end up, this number is probably never going to be larger than the 4 million number we saw this year, right? Unless we have an override.
And if you have
As we did yeah.
school budget savings from year to year, do they stay with the school department or revert to the town?
They generally stay with the school department because generally and you'll see where we've had surpluses in the last few years, we generally accrue them in a revolving fund in circuit breaker. For instance, the year we just closed, FY13, we had a $400,000 surplus. That's remained in our circuit breaker funding, so it's there to offset something that may happen in the future. So the answer is generally yes, we get to carry that money forward. Yeah.
How does the percentage of kids in special ed in Brookline compare to other sister districts?
We can get that data. I don't have it tonight. I have how we compare with ourselves over the last 4 years. Right. We believe we're a little lower. Is state average So
17.
17, okay. And is that 17 all in, or is that 17 K to 12, do you know? Because remember, we're 16 K to 12, we're 18 everybody pre-K, out of district, services only, and, K-12. So, I mean, we can actually nail that down for you. So we're in the range, but, yeah.
So it's a theorem that step increases can't be positive forever. Right? So when do we hit the point where those turn negative again?
It would be when we get a lot more people on the top step, right? Right.
So where are we relative to that?
Well, I have a chart of that. We're not real close, okay? Yeah, we have a lot of young staff. I shouldn't jump to it yet.
Okay.
Yeah. But there are two charts in here that show, one is the years of service graph, and the other is the grid. They're both in here, yeah. Chad.
So I just want to make sure that I'm understanding this table correctly. So
Yeah.
the number at the bottom, the net surplus or shortfall, or always shortfall in this case, is the additional shortfall caused by the changes in that year?
Yes.
So that if I look at FY16, for example,
Yep.
it's not a net shortfall of 2.3 million, it's a net shortfall of 4 million, because the 1.7 also carries through into FY16. So it's a growth in the shortfall. Right, but everything, each
I'm
of these
sorry.
things here is just the change.
Yes, everything in the prior year carries forward.
Right,
This
so
is in-
if we,
yeah.
if we just sort of went like this, our FY15 shortfall would be 1.7, our FY16 would be 4,
Yeah.
our FY17 would be 5.3.
Yes, and in fact, if you look at one of the charts that Sean has done when he does a 5-year projection for the town,
Right.
he actually totals that deficit number. Says if nothing changed, this is what we'd face.
Okay, I just
The reality is, that something does change, because we have to have a budget,
Sure.
right? But it's balanced every year, so we have to either make reductions or find more revenue. But this is saying that if you look at the total incremental growth for next year, and if we were to get 2 million in revenue, we'd face this level of deficit.
Okay.
And there are, as you'll see as we move forward over these months and we begin to talk about fine-tuning an FY15 budget, just about everything in this will change.
Sure.
But this is what we put together last February, saying, here's a snapshot of what could happen.
Right, and just to be clear,
Yeah.
Peter's tired of hearing different school committee members say this, but that number, there are a lot of things that aren't in that number. And so I'm not sure we need to get fixated on the bottom row. I think that, I don't know how much isn't in that number, but a lot. And
That is primarily what we call a maintenance of effort budget, meaning it's about what it would cost to provide the same level of services next year to the same population.
Well, but
Obviously, it's a little different because we have enrollment in here, and, but that's what we call a
But let me
maintenance
be
of effort.
specific. So on the enrollment line, for example, what enrollment does that capture and what doesn't it capture in terms of maintaining ratios?
It doesn't capture and maintain ratios.
Right, so I guess I want to be really clear that in the school committee's point of view, just to editorialize for a moment, we do not consider that in maintenance of effort, because it's, in a sense, as you grow your enrollment, if you don't grow the number of guidance counselors, it is not a maintenance of effort. It's a maintenance of effort if you grow the classroom teachers to the same ratio, all the specialists, the art, music, et cetera, to the same ratio, guidance, nursing, librarians to the same ratio. That's a maintenance of effort. So I think there are different definitions of maintenance of effort, and I think there's a lot that's not on that page that the school committee has really extensive conversations about. That's all.
Yes, so I agree. And the other piece is, I think it makes elementary assumptions in what's going to be a high school world, right? So the assumptions as you add staff at a high school are not the same as they are at an elementary school in terms of the number of staff members and the way those positions are divided up to add 100, 300, 700 students. So you're right, it makes the same sort of assumptions that we've made in the budget projections, which we don't find, I think we agree, don't find to be satisfactory.
And just to be clear, it also doesn't include, as Peter said, any improvements. For example, it assumes the same level of technology.
That's right.
That we have today, which 5 years from now is then a significantly, we're behind now, we would be significantly behind. So I think definition of maintenance of effort is up for debate, let's put it that way.
Well, do you have numbers that have maintenance of effort?
We will. I mean, when I referred earlier to, I'm sure we're going to be back, and I'm sure we're going to be talking about where we think we're short now in terms of those areas, what we think it takes in terms of staffing to meet the numbers that we anticipate coming, and what that technology vision looks like longer term. Yes, we'll be back.
There also are built into this certain assumptions about the number of classrooms needed to accommodate the number of students. And
Right.
as I looked at the B-Space report, it assumes that, for example, if you have 32 kindergarten classrooms last year, you'll have 32 first grade, you'll have 32 second grade the year, first grade the year after, 32 second grade the year after that, and so
Right.
forth. And I think you even footnoted it, Peter, and you said this assumes that there aren't any consolidations.
Right.
So, this is, I think, very much a moving target in both directions.
Well, I'll just disagree slightly with that and say that those numbers, I think, largely are based on our history. And one of the reasons we wanted to go through those slides up front is they're based on a set of assumptions. I think you'd have to change, as you and I've talked about, you'd have to change some of those assumptions
Right.
to get more significant consolidations than we've been able to achieve. We have achieved a number of consolidations over the year, but someone said it's good that you're seeing that growth in kindergarten only and not in the other grades. That's not necessarily true, right? We have seen some numbers tick up in some other grades. So you could do that, but you'd have to change some assumptions about assignments, for example, and other factors pretty severely, I think, as the person who's done that for 10 years, as the person who's done those assignments for 10 years, in order to achieve the consolidations beyond what we've been able to do.
Yeah, for this year, the data between the two of you, from our base budget where we started, we added one kindergarten and we consolidated 2 classes. So that was the change. So it's been a small number the last few years. There were years earlier when our enrollment was lower, when we had more consolidations. We've seen as we've grown, we've had fewer, but the opportunities still occasionally arise.
Susan, I've been recognized here. Isn't part of the problem, we're looking at it at the town-wide budget, and so when you talk ratio, an example, if you had an increase of 10 kids in 8 schools, well, then you have an increase of 80 kids. But that doesn't mean that you would answer that with hiring 1 new school nurse. Am I being clear on that? So because, so I think.
You reach break points at different times.
Yes,
Sure.
exactly.
Right.
So the ratio piece, I understand the importance of taking a look at it, but since you also then have to factor in that you're looking at 8 different buildings and then the
Yeah.
high school.
Sure,
It doesn't consolidate,
It doesn't what? I'm sorry.
you can't consolidate as easily. Is
But
there an algorithm that I'm missing
No,
here?
but on average, right? I mean,
Okay.
sometimes,
All right.
right, you add 20 kids, sometimes you'll get really lucky, and they all fall into classes that
That's not gonna
are 18, right? And they go to 19, and you don't have to add anything,
Bronco.
right? And another time, they fall in, you're really unlucky, and 5 or 6 of them, you have to add classes. But on average, you've got to figure that if you bring in an extra 22 kids, it's going to add an extra classroom. I actually want to reiterate Cliff's request for a real maintenance of effort, which doesn't mean that we're not then going to have to say we're going to have to cut some services. We might have to say, you can't live with 25 maximum.
Right.
What does 26 look like?
Right.
But that's a cut in services, right? And
Right.
We'd like to know, what would we do, what would we need not to cut services?
Right, and within the next 2 weeks, 3 weeks, we'll have that package and be back to talk to you about it.
I do want to apologize because I was wrong when I said it.
You were pretty confident.
You tried.
Pretty,
What the heck?
Is there a logical break point? We're talking about enrollment patterns
And then we moved.
And you go to special
Yeah.
education after that. I'm wondering,
This is as good a spot as any. I mean, the next few slides actually talk some about some patterns of spending and enrollment in special education.
let me ask the
so
committee.
it's really up to the
Would
committee.
you like to keep going?
It
Okay.
seems like we could get through it.
This is an
Excellent.
intrepid group. I mean,
Right. I'll talk.
times you just swung the bat, okay?
We don't want to have to do this again.
I was trying to give the positive spin on it. Janet got hardworking and digging in, and
I don't mean to punish you.
don't want to do this again.
So this is the debate that Dr. Schweikler and I were just having. These are the numbers of our enrollment of special education over the last 4 years. And so what this shows is all in. In other words, every kid we serve, and this includes our private placements. There are some students who we call services only. They go to a private school in Brookline, but they're a Brookline resident. We owe them special education service. And so it's our pre-K, which is that 100-ish students. These are the enrollments over the last 4 years. These are total enrollment over the last 4 years. And this is how that percentage has looked. We've actually dropped slightly. I would say these numbers are flat. And the same is true if you look at our K-12. So this would be our service population in our, in-house programs. Again, we're at just about the 16% range. So we have managed over the last 4 years through, and these are preliminary numbers for the current year, through a number of strategies to keep the number constant as we've grown with total population. The other piece of this is we've been tracking our special ed budget as a percentage of the total, and what you see is that we've managed to actually come down very slightly into both last year and this year in terms of the percentage of the whole that goes to fund special education. This number, by the way, is supposed to be 4.12, I believe. It's on the next page. It's, where is it? 4.12? No, sorry. I'll get it in a minute. It's the FY13 growth number that's taken off this chart.
It's 412. This 4.12.
Yeah, it is right. I'm sorry. Oh, yeah, there it is, right there, 412. So, sorry about that. So that's the total spending of the budget. So again, what this shows is that our total growth of special education has been at or within those numbers. And that's a change in pattern over the last couple of years, because this, looking at our total budget pattern, total spending over the last decade, and the percentage growth per year, you notice in FY09 when we had the override, the number grew 9.5%. Our special education total percentage of the budget had 4 years of double-digit growth. For the last 4 years, we've been essentially within the total budget growth. And so when we look back, and this is the trajectory of what that slope would have looked like had we not been able to take some action. If you look within our special ed program design and management actions, what you see is that we took actions beginning back in 2009 to create what's called a team facilitator model, and this puts someone at every school in charge of decision-making around IEP development, which essentially puts someone in charge of how we spend our money in that area. We also made choices to reallocate a number of our special education aides, which I pointed to when we were looking at staffing patterns earlier, to assign one to every kindergarten and one to every first grade class as an additional position within the K and first grade, where there was a lot of talk of the need for that kind of support for those classroom teachers, for those young students. We also, in that period of time, developed a number of system-wide programs that the superintendent alluded to earlier, especially some of the development that's happened at the high school that have been successful in retaining students in-house, and this year in bringing back students who were in private placements.
Peter, can I ask just a quick question on that?
I'm sorry. Oh, Jim.
The number of teachers, I think according to the slide that we were looking at before in terms of staffing, was about 319 teachers K-12, and there was 285 positions for special needs with a very big slope. Yet you've kept special education spending more or less at 25.5%, 26%. these are the reasons why you've been able to keep it at that level?
These are the actions that we took within special education that helped us control the spending during that period of years. In other words, if we look back at the number of aides we had, classroom aides we had in '09, special education classroom aides, we call them, many of them were in situations that we call one-on-one, where they were assigned to a student, and some of that was written into an education plan. The management practice and focus at that time, the change was to get away from a one-on-one assignment. If we put an aide in a kindergarten or in a first grade classroom, there's not an expectation as children move from preschool to kindergarten that they're going to need the very close help that they may have experienced with a one-on-one aide or in the model that was in the pre-K. So we were trying to break that cycle, and we believe the data shows that it has really helped in that area. So that was the one-on-one aides. Yeah.
So going back then to the incremental chart, and you don't have to flip back.
Yeah.
And the 770 or whatever that number was of incremental change in special education per year, is that incremental growth then driven by just pure numbers increases? So if we're assuming that it's staying at roughly 18% of the population,
Yeah.
we're
It's
just going to have more kids. Is that what that is?
It's based on actually this slide and this pattern. So when we for instance, when I put the budget together back in February, we didn't have end-of-year data on 13, and we didn't have any data on 14. So 1 year is an anomaly, right? 2 years was, well, that was good. 3 years is, well, we're seeing a pattern here, and maybe 4 years is we've established a pattern here. So one of the things we have been doing over the last few years is having an expectation that we won't just see incremental growth in special ed, but we'll have to add for our private placement costs. We do have to add for, let's say, the tuition cost increase that happens. How much program development will we have to do would be a piece of that. And then what other services that we often acquire through contract might we have to add? So it is an area where it has great variability and where unpredictable move-ins can move it. So in some ways, that 700 is based on old patterns, and it's based on the fact that it's hard to predict, and it's based on the fact that we've experienced success in growing some programs. How much of that will we have to do? But it's one of those areas that I think, based on this pattern, we'll need to fine-tune and say, where should that money go if we're going to add it to that program? How best to get something positive out of that?
Just a quick clarification, this reallocation of the aides, does that mean for budgetary purposes that the same body is now in a different budget category? Or you're just saying this special education expense is being deployed differently?
You want to answer that? Okay.
What it means is that we made a conscious shift in creating a more preventative model. So we didn't take one-to-one paraprofessionals away from a student who was in 5th grade because that one-to-one was in their IEP. But where we had opportunities as kids entered, if they had a one-to-one, we talked with the parent. Required a lot of work by those team facilitators, a lot of work by Vicki Milstein and her staff who were here earlier to talk to parents about this different approach. That is that they weren't going to have a one-to-one in that IEP, but the classroom support was going to be there in the form of this classroom aide. And it was going to be there, our commitment, in kindergarten and 1st grade. And as you do that, as you get into 2nd grade and 3rd grade, those paraprofessionals didn't need to continue on with the majority of those kids. Now, some kids then picked up a para, but generally speaking, if they picked up a para support, they picked it up as a 2-on-1 or a 3-on-1 instead of the 1-to-1. And then that became a matter of how we do groupings when students get to 2nd and 3rd grade.
So is that paraprofessional, though, still carried in the special ed budget? If it's assigned to a classroom?
that's a good
That's what I
question.
was
Yes.
just trying to-
Yes.
The answer is yes, we continue to carry it in our special education budget. Although we actually there are multiple sources of funding for aides. We have a kindergarten grant that we get from the state. It was one of those grants you saw earlier. Some of our kindergarten aides are paid through that. And some of our 1st grade aides are actually staff positions that are interns through an agreement we have with Wheelock College. So we actually fund that out of the general fund in a different category. So, but generally, we kept those aids so we could compare over time.
Peter, could you go back to slide 44?
Sure.
And
Yeah.
I'm just curious as to what happened in 2008. What occurred then, and why the anomalous year? And
Yeah. Oh, yeah, I remember.
Yeah, so this is a great, thank you for the question, because this is a great illustration of what Peter's been talking about. I mean, the story I was thinking about when Peter said this is an unpredictable business, right? This is our snow removal, or one example of our snow removal that Sean talked about last week, in that we were in a budget meeting last year, walked out, and Dr. Schmuckler had a family who just moved in from another state, waiting for her with their child's IEP, to talk to her about the out-of-district placement that the child had been in that location, major six figures that we now had inherited off of a 3-hour budget meeting. That's the world of dealing with our budget in special education. That year is about a significant number of students who turned 22 and aged out. We have a number that we look at every year as we look at the numbers who age out. We look at that number, we factor some percentage of it into the budget. That happened to be a year when there was a number that was significantly larger than we've seen in any of the other years in this budget. It's as simple as that.
Right, it was student change. A lot of them were turning 22, but I think there were other factors too.
Oh, some moves,
Yeah,
sure.
yeah. And then look at fiscal 10. So we actually saw the total spending drop, but then 2 years later, is the year that we had $1 million overage, and we had to go to the town for the $500,000 reserve fund transfer. So the reverse happened to us, which we had move-ins and pushed us way over our budget. So it's that anomaly within the contracted services area of special education that really puts pressure on it. We wanted to, as we begin the conversation about benchmarking and trying to understand how we compare, one of the pieces of data we pulled from the Department of Education is what they call per pupil spending. They gather data from all school systems every year, and they create a number which they call the per pupil spending calculation. This is a chart of the 20 highest spending communities in the state, with the exception of those that have fewer than 1,000 students. So for instance, Tisbury I took out of the list, and Ware and Gosnold and places you've never heard of, right? So what we see is that Brookline's actually right in the middle. We're the 10th highest spending of this group. And if you look at the difference, the state actually created this particular category of per pupil spending back in 2005, and has generated it through 12. We'll get the numbers for last year, FY13, in about December, so we'll have another data point to add to this, and we'll see where we are. But what we see is that we're listed, as I said, we're listed as number 10. We've grown, during that period of time, our per pupil spending has grown 20%. This universe of 20 communities, the per pupil spending during that period of time has grown 28%. Some look oddly low, Nantucket. Some look oddly high, Randolph. Well, we know, they had a large override in that year. I actually graphed Brookline, Newton, and Lexington to try and get a handle on, see if I could see any patterns going on here. What we do know about Brookline is in 2009, we had an override. So you see we bumped up in our per pupil spending. But for the last 4 years, 9, 10, 11, and 12, we've actually been flat in terms of the calculation of per pupil spending. And when you think about that in terms of our enrollment growth, and however you define maintenance of effort, just being able to define not a whole lot of program advancement, that makes sense. What we know about Newton is they actually had an override in 13, so when we get to 13, didn't they? Yeah. So we get the 13 numbers, we may see them bump a little. I don't have any inside data on Lexington, so I don't have much to, if you will, benchmark the programmatic and achievement side, but at least we have some numbers to look at spending, yeah.
This also includes this would include special education.
Yes, this actually includes everything. So they take the filing that communities do this includes the town spending for schools, because this includes our benefits, our building services, our parks, et cetera. In other words, all that service. So this is a fully loaded cost, and that's why the number is actually so high.
Is transportation included there? Is
Yes,
that
transportation,
reimbursed by
no,
the state?
transportation is in this one, yeah.
Okay.
But the cost of
So that
capital
would-
projects is excluded, right?
I think it is, yes.
Yes, yes.
Yes, I think it is, from this calculation, yeah. We wanted to list some actions that we've taken over the last, this one goes back to '05, efficiencies. We know that one of the conversations you'll be having is, what are those areas where the school department could look to do business better? We've listed a number of things here. The significant ones in the last couple of years are a significant change we made in our home-based service program within our special education budget that saved us both in fiscal 13, and we believe will save something significant this year in FY 14. The other large number, and actually Dr. Schmuckler recommended I make this number higher, but I moved it down to 445,000, is the students returning to the district-wide programs that the superintendent mentioned earlier. We had a number of students come back. They've saved us at least this number. By the time I get full data by the first quarter, I'll have a little better sense of what that number looks like. But preliminarily, it looks like the number's going to be in that range. Yes, sir, Kevin.
These are listed as efficiencies.
Yes.
Some of these look to me like service cuts. Can you distinguish between them for us, at least for the big items?
One man's service cut is another man's efficiency. The answer is, as you know,
Class size would
Yeah.
not be an efficiency.
Right.
It would save money.
Again, as you know, we've been under the gun over the last X years as we put our budget together to both be as efficient as possible and to make sure that we were flagging the community on actions we were taking. So the answer is yes, some of these are borderline. If you look at the fourth item, freeze the director of data management.
That's what came to mind.
This organization struggles to provide the kind of data that we were asked for tonight without a director of data to look at our academic performance. We made a choice last year to save $100,000 in FY 13, and we made a choice as we developed the current year budget to not add that position back. We're currently revisiting that, but to your question, is that an efficiency or is that a program cut? That's clearly a program cut. Yeah. Our point here was to list those kinds of actions we had to take in order to make a budget. And there are other examples like this. I would argue that some of the actions we took in here where we restructured our custodial service and contracted out positions to support the in-house position is an efficiency. I would argue that the consolidation of the payroll office with the town was an efficiency. So, those kinds of actions. But when we consolidated our system-wide technology support, we probably lost some program. But we had to make some tough choices.
Could you explain the
Yeah.
home-based service
Sure.
savings?
Sure. Home-based services is a name for service where literally professionals, and I'm going to need help on this, professionals and go into the home and work with students, generally, am I correct, autistic, but they could be in a range of needs, where service providers go into the home.
You're doing a good job. You're good. You're never staying here.
Home-based services is generally.
Dr. Schmuckler, our Assistant Superintendent for Student Services.
Hello. It's generally for students on the autism spectrum, but not all. So the majority of students who get home-based services, and that is part of a state-mandated piece on their IEPs that you look at students generalizing skills between school and home. It's also students with emotional behavioral needs and students with profound medical disabilities and developmental disabilities who would also, up until 2 years ago, we had contracted them out to agencies. And there were a couple of things. It was both very expensive, but we also had issues around quality. And so we looked at bringing all of those services back in-house by hiring our own board-certified behavioral analysts. So those are people who oversee the program and set up programs in school and home.
and then also hiring our own, what we call direct service professionals, who are actually doing the one-on-one work both at school and at home. And so by doing that, one, we got control of numbers, of sessions, but we also got control of the quality. And so we're in year 2. So last year we took the whole program and did it, initially it was a staged, and we just kind of jumped in and did it K through 12. And so this year we're moving into year 2 and looking, I think as we do, to build the program, to doing quality. We're about to start a parent education series offered to parents at night and in the mornings from our BCBAs. So really looking at both quality and efficiencies in that program.
Thank you.
So the numbers to go with Karen's program are that we actually took a structural $300,000 out of our FY13 budget as we moved from contracted service to in-house. We not only made that number, but we made an additional $200,000 in savings that we were able to build into FY14. So we took, well, what in FY12 was $1 million cost, that this year is budgeted, we believe will deliver at $500,000.
And I think the important point is we didn't cut. There was no reduction of services. So students are getting the same level of service on the IEP, but just with a more efficient management system. So I think that's
Right,
good.
right.
Great, thank you.
That's why we led with that.
Peter, could I just ask one quick question?
Yes.
Again, is there another list like this that you've done as part of a planning process? Should you have a shortfall and have to do 10, 20 things that you'd say, this is the least painful, this is more painful? Is there some list like that you've developed?
Yes, we have lists like that. We generally generate them every budget cycle.
You burn them
Well,
at the
as
end
I
of
say,
every day?
Our initial budget this year, actually, we were proposing cutting our enrichment and challenge support, which is what we call a gifted and talented program. And we were cutting back on our music program significantly, so.
Also on that, there's also a corresponding list of revenue opportunities that we choose not to
Yeah.
pursue. For
We
example,
talked about charging for
raising-
full-day kindergarten.
Charging for full-day kindergarten is the one that generated the most excitement.
Yes.
I don't mean that in a good way. Athletic fees, I mean, there's sort of a revolving set of revenue things. that
Right, we
look
raised
at.
our athletic fee $100 this, for the current year.
And just, those are school committee decisions?
Yes, they are.
Those are decisions of the school committee as opposed to town meeting?
They are. We were talking earlier, Kevin asked a question about staff, sorry. So what this graph shows is the number of our teachers who are in their first 5 years, 0 to 4 is this category here. And then every 5-year cohort going forward. And one of the reason we actually show 5 years here is because when we, generally every time I put the slide up and show 1 year, folks say, wow, that's different, that's a new pattern. It really isn't. We have a significant number of new hires. I think it's 43%. We had this graph earlier with percentages. I thought it was more useful. We're looking at absolute numbers. So this year we have 333 of our teaching staff. And this, I should qualify that. This is really what we call our Unit A group. In other words, these are teachers or teacher equivalents, which means guidance counselors, nurses, BCBAs, in other words, service professionals who are equivalent to teachers. They're generally a certified member of our teacher bargaining team. And so you see the pattern of, this is the pattern of how many years of service they've been in Brookline. And so we have a significant churn, to use Dick's word from earlier. Notice we have a number of folks in our first 5 years. And that's characteristic, we think, of what we're seeing in education, where if you went 20 plus years ago, folks often, it was a career forever. There's a lot more turnover today than there was in years before. To Kevin's question, how do our people distribute across our salary grid? Our salary grid gives a premium for a master's or master's plus 45, or a doctoral degree. And then folks move up the salary scale annually, eventually maxing out at a step that's dependent on where they are in the lane. 226 of our people are at top step. So to Kevin's question, that means 467 are in the lanes, meaning every year they'll be moving forward. It's about a $2,500 delta from one step to the next. And so So that's built into our salary grid. And so given the numbers here, this is why we budget for step and lane. These numbers would have to be significantly different. And so what you see is we have enough folks, especially master's degree, but enough folks down in the lanes that'll be moving forward every year. So that'll be a significant cost each year.
And is there a lot of, I mean, how much judgment is in this? Is this similar in other school systems, or Brookline has its own?
The judge, if I'm understanding, the judgment is when you're first hired. So Bill was referring earlier to this question of we have some new flexibility in our collective bargaining agreement, current compared to prior years, current 3-year compared to any prior contracts, where there's more flexibility in judgment in terms of your first step. Once you're here, it depends on your education. You can move up a lane, right? But otherwise, as long as you're more than a half-time teacher, for every year of full-time service, you move up a step.
And is the value of the step the same here as it is in other places?
You mean?
There's about $2,500 per step.
It varies.
30,000 in Newton and 2,000 in Wellesley, or are they all the same?
The answer is probably it's in that neighborhood, although when we were looking at this a few years ago, we saw a couple of communities that had a significant jump from next to top to top. I don't know what the history was for that. There are communities that are working to try and change this model, which is the historic, if you will, model in collective bargaining in Massachusetts between school systems. So if you go to virtually any school system in the community and ask to see a teacher's salary table, it'll look a lot like this. My understanding is that in Lawrence, the receiver is probably in negotiations trying to change that and is battling hard. I mean, it's a very difficult collective bargaining issue.
Springfield's another place.
Springfield, okay. So it's a very hard thing to change, but there are some question whether the value that you get for this old measure of achieving diplomas is the right way to compensate teachers.
But if you stay within your lane, the effective average salary increase associated with this step is?
$2,500.
Which corresponds to what on average?
Oh,
We're talking about percentage?
yes, 3%.
Okay.
2.5 to 3, depending on where you are, yeah.
So the collective bargaining discussion is all additive to the
To
step?
that, yes, to that base, yes.
So just one parenthetical. So the average step increase, assuming it doesn't go on infinitely, is sort of greater than your pro forma, just steps alone are greater than your pro forma modeling for revenue.
Well, they're about 1%. So I think what we showed here was the percent for collective bargaining for the system is just over 700,000. And we budget 700. Was that your question?
Well, if I understood you correctly, a step
Yes,
is 3%, and you're modeling revenue growth at 2.5%.
I think.
No, oh yes, we model revenue growth at 2.5% because these are independent events. What I showed there, unless I'm misunderstanding, was that in addition to steps, which we listed as a net cost of 750, we put in a 1% salary increase. We were trying to lay out the expenditures cost model separate from whatever revenue would be. And those revenue numbers for those 5 years were calculations that Sean did based on some preliminaries that he's been working on. So they're independent events, is that?
I guess my point is, no matter how the collective bargaining comes out, it feels as though the steps are hardwired such that the salary increase is going to be greater than your likely revenue increase. So,
when you add the two together.
even if you don't, I guess.
There's
Steps is gross, steps is about 1.1 million.
Yeah.
Which corresponds to, what is this, as a percentage
what is that
increase
as a
on payroll?
percent?
I thought you said it's about it.
Well,
But not everyone gets it.
it's 3% for those who
Yeah.
get it.
Right. Yeah, not everyone.
And it ranges, if you're at the lower end, it's a higher percent than the high end, right?
Right.
And you don't get it on the top step.
Look at the numbers in that bottom right
But
step.
it's also that people leave and they get replaced by
drop
people
out.
at lower steps, which is why, on average, it should be 0. But if you have a relatively young group and they're aging, you have a positive, at some point, it'll turn negative.
Yeah.
Now we're in a a positive range.
Yeah, that's a worry, because I think about Kevin's earlier question a lot, right? And when I look at charts like we saw earlier, we're retaining people longer than the national average, but the new national average is 5 to 7 years, right? It's not, they're not going into this to stay in as a career like I did, or some people who've retired in the last number of years. That's not the nature of public school teaching. And again, we're getting people who are tending to commit a little bit longer, and so I worry about that churn and what that means on a salary schedule.
There are, I think, a lot of factors that are working, if I'm correct. As you bring in a younger teacher, you're going to have steps that will play through each year for that teacher that will offset. On the other hand, looked at in total, if that teacher is replacing an older teacher who's higher on the scale already, there could be a net saving.
Right, if.
And if you're in a growth mode, it's going to be a different situation. So there's a difference between the impact on an individual teacher, where the step of 3% would be greater than a 1% collective bargaining increase, but that may not be true looking at the budget.
Absolutely. In terms of our overall budget, first budget I did with Peter, I think we budgeted a net for steps of something like $450,000.
Yeah.
Right?
We've been as low as $250.
And we've been as low as $250, and now.
We've been negative.
Pardon?
We've been negative.
Oh, okay, well, okay. So, and now we're budgeting $750,000, $850,000.
But just
We're
not-
much closer to that gross.
But what isn't in that number is when you have younger staff, you also have, because many of them are female, increased maternity leaves, you have substitute teacher costs.
You have mentoring costs.
You have
and-
mentoring
yes.
costs, like, there's a whole other, just to your
Yes.
point, just to reinforce your point, Dick, there are many, many costs involved in that.
So 2 questions. One, just to make sure I understand, net means it's just their salary and not their benefits? Is that correct?
Net, it means it's only their salary, and it means net of the retirement
Right,
savings.
Just
Yes.
the gross, this is, I'm going to get on my
Salary only.
W-2 and.
Salary only.
Right. When you replace teachers, do you try to keep a mix in terms of qualifications, years of experience, degrees that they have? Because there's a trade-off. Young, inexperienced teachers, I would imagine, in the product they deliver.
So that's a good question, and that it really goes back to what I said earlier in terms of Sergio's question, right? So before, that was very difficult, because we had a budget, we had a very lockstep salary schedule, which prevented me from, in some cases, prevented our principals from looking at people with more years of experience. But with this flexibility, I can take someone who has X number of years, I can make them a different offer, and unlike what we were told when we were bargaining that, they accept it to come here.
Apart from the dollars amount, the dollar amount, which is important, do you try to keep a mix in terms of experience in your staff?
The answer is yes, and more so in some positions than others. Those BCBAs, for example, that Dr. Schmuckler talked about, given what they were going to do, we wanted a particular profile in terms of experience if we were going to make that program work. So yes, we absolutely do. And all I'm saying is that collective bargaining agreement actually allows us to do more of that. Mhm.
Sorry, can I just, one clarification of because I think that last point brought it up. When we talk about 0 to 4 years on slide 51, I think, some teachers come here with experience.
Yes,
And
yes,
so-
this is years of service in Brookline.
So
You're
this is
correct.
years of service
Yeah.
in Brookline, Janet. So sometimes, number one, you might have somebody who was a paraprofessional in a classroom for 2 years as a certified teacher. They'd already passed, gotten their certification, they served as a paraprofessional, but then became a first-year teacher after having done it for many
So they're not
years.
starting on step 1?
So no, they are. That's the
They are.
point. They are, even though they have multiple years of experience, let's say in another district, or I think if they have experience as a para, it doesn't count against this, right?
Well, the answer is
We have flexibility.
We have flexibility, okay. So anyway,
They'll
but
generally
just your
get some
point about
reward.
quality, 0 to 4 doesn't mean that they're
That they just got
right
out
out
of school.
that they got right out of school, okay.
Right, this is years of service in Brookline. I should have qualified, I should have emphasized that, I apologize. One of the questions that you've asked us is about the METCO student enrollment. METCO program moves approximately 3,000 students from Boston to suburban communities. Brookline has the second highest? Right, Newton has the highest enrollment, Brookline has the second. We're approximately 300, you notice, each year. This year we show 297, we've been just about 300 for each of these years. And this shows the distribution of those students across our grades. The next graph shows more in detail the distribution of these students across our buildings within those same grades. So it shows the impact and how we attempt to assign students in a manner, from a fiscal standpoint. There's a whole bunch of social issues in terms of assignment of students. But from a fiscal standpoint, our goal is to distribute students from both this and the materials fee in a way that we don't hit those breakpoints needing to add additional sections. Obviously, as students move forward over the years, there can be complications from that. So we have 297 METCO students. The structure of METCO is that we receive a grant from the state of $1.3 million. About $327,000 of that goes to transportation, meaning there's $1 million that comes to the town. $492,000 of that is used for staff that provide services to METCO students. The other $515,000 is used where we pay classroom teachers. So we pay for the salaries of 6 classroom teachers sort of randomly distributed around the system. So that $1 million, if you looked at it as what's the per pupil funding, for that 297 students, that $1 million, $1.8 million, is $33.95 per student. So if you netted that against the number that we showed earlier, which is that last per pupil number we have from the state at 16.6, it says that the theoretical cost of those students to Brookline is $13,200 a head, where the total is about a $4 million cost.
Peter,
It's
can you
not
just
clear that this fully loaded number is the right way to analyze
Right,
it.
and I was just going to ask, have you ever tried to come up with the marginal cost
Yeah.
of, is that something that's
Well-
possible, or?
If I were standing in front of you 10 years ago, I would have said, we believe the marginal cost is pretty low because they're the 19th or the 20th kid in the classroom.
Right, and now it's.
And now that we've had this enrollment growth, it's much harder to make that argument, and I see Lee Selwyn's sign here. Every time we've gone to the advisory committee over the last 3 or 4 years, Lee has hammered that point home, that, it's harder and harder to make that argument.
Where you're capacity constrained. Yep.
Right, exactly, yeah. Yeah,
I
Kevin.
have at least a couple questions. One is, do we have an idea of how, other than those who are graduating, what our attrition from the METCO program is in a typical year?
Good question. I don't have that data.
No, I don't.
We can get, yeah, that, yeah.
How do we come up with 300?
I don't know, I think it was negotiated at the beginning
I believe that's right.
of the program, which was back in the 70s.
I believe that's right.
I think it was, don't exactly quote me because I was an infant. The idea was that there were 6% of the school-age population in Brookline in 72 or 3 when METCO started. 6% were children of color, African-American kids, because Asian kids and Latinos were not counted in this. So about 6%, and they wanted it to match the statewide figure for African-American kids, and that would be 12%. So we took 6% of the number of school kids in Brookline, and that was our METCO number.
I don't believe that
So it was
number has
reflected.
changed dramatically.
So it was reflected in our,
Right. I believe resident African-American population is still about 6% of our total population, so that the 300 METCO and the 300 resident are about, yeah.
That's right.
So it's not like rediscussed on an annual basis, or it's.
No, it's been the commitment of Brookline annually to take 300. We've never revisited it.
Is there, I don't see this here, but a diversity profile for each school?
We would have that.
It's actually as close as we have to that in-house school in Brookline.
Yes, yes. We have a brochure called At School in Brooklyn. It's the annual report.
Make sure you
Yeah.
I've seen it, does it actually give for each school?
believe it does. I could be wrong, but I believe it does.
Does it have a diversity profile, Jennifer, the at school? Diversity profile, is it an at school? Oh, it doesn't,
I
okay.
don't, I don't for that.
be district.
It's just,
The answer is we have it. Yeah.
yeah, I think that would be interesting to have.
Department of Ed, yeah, it's very detailed.
So, follow-up question, since
School by
it's
school.
partially got answered. We're the second largest program in numbers. What are we in percentages relative to our population? I know Lincoln is largest. Are we the second largest in terms of number of Metco students relative
Go
to
the
our
school.
student population? Or
I
does
don't
anybody know where we stand?
Yeah, I don't know the answer to that, Kim.
That's probably true, Kevin.
Okay.
That's probably right.
And then in response to Jim's question, I think we can get a lower bound on the cost, because if we were to say, replace Metco with school choice, right, you can probably better than anybody else at this table calculate what we would get, right? And it would be more than we would get from Metco. So we know, but that's the very least that it could be costing us, because that would be, if we had 300 school choice students, all of the costs would be essentially the same.
Do you want to explain to people what Metco School Choice, what that trade-off is? I'm not sure everybody knows what that
Oh,
means.
sorry, Jim might be better at this than I am.
One, either of you, since you happen to be experts nationally, both of you, on this question.
So, as either Peter or Bill alluded to earlier, there is a Massachusetts School Choice Program under which we could agree to accept a certain number of students from outside of Brookline. Jim, correct me on anything I say that's wrong. The rules are then that we would have to accept them on the basis of a lottery within a grade. Right? So we could say we want 10 kindergarten students and 30 first graders or whatever. We would be reimbursed according to a formula which would include more dollars per student. I don't follow closely enough to know what it would be now. It would include transportation costs to the border of Brookline, which in our case would pretty much be to Brookline, to the schools, and we would be reimbursed for all the special education expenses. Right? So that provides a lower bound on the amount of money we could get if we replaced Metco with school choice. I want to be clear, I'm not advocating for replacing the Metco program with school choice, right? There are differences, right? Because you lottery students in, you don't get the benefits of diversity and the like. But when people ask how much it costs, I believe very strongly in, yes, it's hard to get the exact price, right? That $4 million price was clearly too high, right? But we can get a lower bound on the cost as well, and that at least helps us get a somewhat better sense of the range of the possible costs.
But the real problem there, Kevin, right, politically, is that the sending district pays us the per pupil expenditure. So it would make a real enemy out of Boston in a lot of ways, because we'd be taking the money from the Boston school, which comes on the cherry sheets a lot from the state, but it's still from the operating budget in Boston.
I want to repeat what I said, I'm not advocating.
No, I
for-
know you're not advocating, I was just mentioning in terms of
Right.
Barry. But may I mention
That's why I wanted to let you explain it.
May I mention something in terms of Metco, because I'll just pull seniority here. Metco came in as an idea, and Bob Sperber, who was the superintendent here in Brookline, was one of the founding fathers of it, because the NAACP came up from DC, and they were suing Boston, Massachusetts, everyone, to integrate schools. And that was coming on the tails of trying to have lawsuits about housing. So Brookline wasn't about to make major decisions about putting up a lot of public housing. It didn't look as though we were going to go over our 6% of indigenous or residential African-American families and hit the state level. So we were really open to a lawsuit, which would put Brookline kids on buses. And a lot of people said, that would never happen, couldn't go over town lines. Tell that to St. Louis, tell that to Los Angeles. Take a look at Eyes on the Prize. It was bloody, it was tearful, it was horrible. And a group of superintendents said, volunteer busing. So that meant inner-city kids got on a bus at 6 in the morning and went to Linfield or Duxbury. The idea was that it would be a short-term, i.e. 5-10 years, and then the housing market would bring more integration. That didn't happen. But this bill is paid so that we didn't have to deal with a huge lawsuit that would have put Brookline kids on buses to the Murphy School in Dorchester. And if you don't think that that would have killed the property values in the town in 73 or 74, so this program came from a lot of bloodshed. I'm sorry if I'm repeating the history from a lot of people, but I was standing on lines at the time. And we still have it. If you ever told me we were going to have it almost 40 years later, who would have believed it? But there we are.
And how are Medco students selected? Why?
There is a Metco Incorporated, which is an organization in Boston that through some process that I wouldn't pretend to characterize, selects students who I believe their parents tend to sign them up at birth. This is at least what I'm told. In other words, there's a lot of advocacy for folks who believe their kids could be eligible to join the program and then get the opportunity to go to suburban schools. So.
And Metco decides what district to send them to?
They name a number of choices.
And you get to select who comes in?
And our coordinator, along with other coordinators for the program, goes to Metco Inc. and looks through those files for some number of students that match the grade levels that we're looking for, which is generally kindergarten.
Could I just make one very brief point on budgets? Something to keep in mind is it's a program of 3,300 children, 300 in the Springfield area, 3,000 in the Boston area. The budget was about $20 million, probably through 2006, and it's been cut to probably, superintendent would know this number probably better than I do, but I think it's about $16 million at the moment.
That's right.
And part of, I think, the issue here is the only productive thing that we should probably talk about, my perspective, sorry. My view is the most productive way to think about this is to advocate for an increase in funding for the Metco program.
I agree.
Yeah.
The materials fee program is the other program by which we bring in students. These are the children of employees. I think I have these slides backwards. Wait a minute. There's the total. So that you see the pattern over the last few years, the last 5 years, we've actually moved up in terms of the total enrollment. And in fact, the delta is, if we went back another 5 years, I think the enrollment was about 100. So this is where we've seen growth, and this relates actually to a number of issues. One which you already focused on, which was that we do have a lot of young teachers as we've had turnover, and they've been having a lot of kids over the last few years. And so there's demand on the organization from employees whose children are becoming kindergarten age, which is where the primary growth has happened. Because you see that pattern as we go up to the high school grades, 5th and above, or 6th and above, the numbers tend to drop. So we have 178 of those students enrolled this year, and their distribution across our schools is, as you see on this chart. Our materials fee students the employee pays $24.90. We have this says 177, there's actually 178. We bring in $440,000 worth of revenue. This was a number that was back in one of the first slides that said tuition and other fees. This goes into that pot which supplements the general fund. And again, if you look at this theoretically against that 16.6, it costs us about $2.5 million. And the value to the organization is the retention of employees and the attraction of employees. So the question on the table is is the value of that program worth the cost of that program, however we calculate it. The last few slides are primarily on housing stock. And we asked the the planning department to work with us on looking at the geographical map of the town to try and understand where our students were residing in the community, to understand the properties and the data. This is for last school year, showed that we had 39% owner occupied, 28, single family, I believe that was, 28% residing in condominiums, and just under 32% residing in rental property. This is the distribution by school, and you notice some patterns. For instance, Lawrence School shows 40% of the population resides in condominiums, which is, and 39% at Pierce. So there are certain sections of town where condominium growth over the years, 37% at Devotion, where it seems to have had a significant impact on where if we had taken this snapshot from prior year, from decades before this conversion, where there are opportunities for folks to move to the community and purchase property. So that if you look at the the owner versus rental, we have 39% own a condo, 18%, 39% own, 18% own a condo, 57% own in total, 31% rent, 10% rent a condo, so 42% rent, 57% own of the totals. Again, this distribution count.
Do you have any data on the breakdown by grade in terms of the housing stock?
We didn't do this. I'm trying to remember if so we would have it, for instance, if there's two kids in a family, we'd know at a certain residence, there's a third grader and a fifth grader.
Mm-hmm.
So that data is behind this. We haven't analyzed it that way for this.
What?
But it could be analyzed, yeah. And this was one snapshot at a point in time. I'm sorry, Dick.
What conclusions do you draw from this?
Well, this is a snapshot at a point in time. The only conclusion that we were pushed to think about was this question of, has our enrollment growth been exacerbated by the change in the housing stock, meaning a lot more condominiums? So it was looking at this question of, are we more apt today to have families in housing that X years ago families wouldn't have lived in? And that was the theory.
Well, let me just ask a couple of quick questions here. First of all, there were a number of properties. Well, let me start again. Do we know that the condo conversion per se added units or just changed the type of ownership?
I don't know that.
Okay,
My guess
because
is
the
it just
example is that
for
there are
many,
many.
just changed the type of ownership.
Exactly. In other words, there are many two-family homes that became two condos. And so that doesn't add to the housing stock. It just changes the form of ownership.
Right.
That would be an important question. In fact, the general information that we received and MGT had included was that between 2000 and 2010, there was a net add of about 135 units. That's a very small number.
Is that from new construction?
Net add to the town.
That's the, refer back to Rich. The increase between 1990 and 2000, this is in the Commission in the Understanding Brookline report, is more like a net of 1,000 units. That's why one of the things the B-Space Committee looked at was that when we kept on wondering about the growth and the low growth in terms of additional net units between 2000 and 2010, it didn't make any sense. And that's when we looked at 1990 to 2000, thanks to the Understanding Brookline report, and it was a longer 85-page version of that. And the net unit growth in that previous decade was extraordinary.
So I hate to do
So it
this, but
depends
will
on
you
the period you're
will you
looking at.
summarize that for the microphone? Sorry.
Sure. Rebecca Stone, member of the school committee, is reminding me that one of the pieces of data was that 135 was in the last decade. There was apparently a significant number of additions in the prior decade.
But the theory is what? That there's a 20-year delay before the kids show up?
Oh, I can't answer that question, but if you look at the housing stock growth during that period of time, it seems to have caused that to happen.
Right, and at the same time, the population of the town during that period didn't change. Essentially, you went from 57,000 to 59,000.
With 1,000 more kids 9 years and younger.
Right. Change of demographics. Strange. Okay, thanks.
Yeah, no, it's.
Can I get one other clarification on the materials
Food for
fee
thought.
students? That's eligibility is defined not just by being a teacher, but being a town employee.
Correct.
How many of those are teachers? How many of the parents who are in that system are teachers as opposed to firemen or policemen or other employees?
The answer is approximately 40 of them are town employees, not school employees.
Okay.
And I don't have the breakdown of the remaining school employees. They would be primarily teacher or teacher equivalents, but we can get you that data.
What you're saying is that about 135 of the children are the children of teachers?
Yes, or
Thank
school
you.
employees, yes.
Thank you.
And the one other piece I'd add to that is what we've started to do within the last few years, just to sort of flesh out those data a bit. We've started to survey people, only teachers, only our teachers, again, since they're the majority. And the numbers are consistent with these numbers, actually they're higher than the numbers you see in kindergarten and first grade. In other words, we've asked them, are you planning to enroll a child here as an employee? You don't reside in Brookline. Next year, the following year after that. And the numbers are large. They're in the upper 20s each of those years. And that really corresponds to what we've seen in terms of our staff and their leaves and those kinds of things.
Do the students tend to stay in the system,
Yes,
even through high school?
yes.
How many different employees are there? How many different families?
Well, that's a good question.
We actually have that count. I want to say of school, it's like 92 of that 100, of the 130 students, it's something like 92 employees. I forget the number for town, but it's a fewer than the number of kids.
Do we know what towns they reside in? I mean, are they
We do.
mostly Boston or?
Yeah, we do. I don't have that data to, yeah, show.
They provide transportation.
Oh, they do.
Yeah, oh, yes,
So that-
yes. yeah. We are, two last slides, and then John Adams. The point I wanted to just show here, I think Tim mentioned earlier that state aid is a mix of things, including education aid. And what the town needs to do annually is understand state aid in its broader context. There's unrestricted government aid, and then of course, there are also assessments that come from the state. But if you look at the state aid, of this approximately $16 million number for the current year, which Sean was pointing out on this slide is the same as '02, approximately $10 million of that is education aid. One of the issues we ran up against this year is we were having the conversation that Susan did not enjoy, which was about the idea of charging for full-day kindergarten. Remember, we're required by state law to provide the half-day kindergarten. We can charge tuition for full day. We've been offering it for a decade without a fee to citizens. We began to, as we looked at the budget for this year, began to talk about what would the consequence be. We're in an odd situation where, in '07, an odd situation, the state set something they called target aid for communities that don't receive significant Chapter 70, that every community should receive at least 17.5% of their foundation budget back in Chapter 70 aid. That was not able to be funded by the state until 2 years ago. We're in this window where you see our Chapter 70 aid has actually grown for the last 2 years. And we are not at 17.5%. So if, as we look in 15, if the state budget is of a nature where the governor can continue to fund additional Chapter 70 aid, it's possible that we'll get another uptick for the next year. The governor's original budget for FY14 had that fully funded and actually had twice the growth for Brookline. So there's another about $1 million opportunity, would you say that? Which, so as we look to the FY15, there's the possibility that we'll grow to that. The twist is that had we changed our rules and charged for kindergarten, the formula would have pulled those students out of the count, and we would have lost any opportunity for that additional state enrollment growth. So by raising $1 million, by charging for kindergarten, we were potentially losing $1 million in state aid at this particular point in time. So we, and for many qualitative reasons, not just financial, we backed off the proposal.
But just one point on that, if you can back up. So one question that we frequently got as school committee members is, wow, it sounds like you guys are skating so close to the edge and suddenly a rabbit gets pulled out of the hat at the last minute. That kind of magically balances your budget. And I think it's worth enumerating what those rabbits have been over time, because they do differ. So, for example, the override
In 09, we
got an override. There was 2 years of ARA.
There were a couple of years where we received federal funding, ARRA funding.
Which was essentially, that was the, when the federal government gave ARRA, that was 2 years. So there was,
Right.
that was 09, 10, 11.
There was the year
the
that-
jobs bill.
Yes, there was the year that, and in addition to that federal funding, there was, now I'm blanking, FY10, wasn't it? FY11, when we entered the GIC.
We entered the GIC, we got a bump from that.
So if you recall back to the graph where Sean was, that's the Group Insurance Commission that saved significantly on health insurance, and we dropped significantly, and that allowed for additional funding.
There was the
both town and
jobs bill,
schools.
which gave us a few $100,000, if I remember correctly. There was, and then the more full funding of Chapter 7.
Right, which-
So
the
increase of the floor towards that 17.5%.
And you see that in the last 2 years. This
So
is
anyway,
where
all I want to
Chapter
do is validate the theory that somehow a rabbit gets pulled out of the hat at the last minute through some one-time infusion of funding, because that actually does happen. Meaning, we do get these one-time infusions of funding, but I think what it masks is essentially, I think where Tim was going with the structural question is, wow, sounds like from collective bargaining alone, you're at a structural deficit against a 2.5% revenue increase, let alone anything else. So it is an interesting question to think about if you try to strip out some of those one-time funds over the last number of years, which some of us do because, we have nothing else to do in our time, what that deficit would have been had we not gotten those infusions. Just something to put in people's minds.
Can I just, a related piece of perspective? Remember, we start building our budget in January, and the superintendent has to present a budget in the middle of February. That's long before we know what state funding will actually be, and it's long before we know the rate that the Group Insurance Commission will set for health insurance. There are a lot of unknowns as we begin our budget, and so we have a responsibility to be, if you will, conservative at certain points of time. So what one might characterize as pulling a rabbit out of a hat may relate to unavailable data at certain points of time as we go through and have conversations.
And also the notification dates.
And,
You might
well,
explain that.
because we have a responsibility in terms of notification, so there are a lot of moving parts in budget development. I don't have to tell all you
What
that.
Peter means by that piece is so we have to notify employees currently, up through this year, we had to notify employees on April 15th about their positions for the next year. So we had to do some things very, very early. Yeah, to the health insurance, issue, a number of years ago, we were working with a 5, and I think we ended up at 2. So that's a pretty significant infusion, right? That makes it look like we pulled a rabbit out of a hat. By the way, that date's changed. Sergio, to your question, I keep thinking of examples, right? That April 15th was problematic in a number of ways. That in the new educator evaluation agreement we have, that date's been moved to May 1st, which is huge for us.
But my only point is that there's a question to ask about what the structure, when we talk about a structural deficit, what that means and what it looks like if you strip out one-time funds that come in at the end. That's all, historically.
Okay. Any further questions?
I apologize for going long.
No, this is a tour de force.
If you have questions, and I'm sure you do, please send them to Susan and to me, and we are putting together an organized, I hope, list of questions that people have and issues to pursue. I know that a number of you have already done that, but please do that. And ideally, if you could do that by the end of the week, that would be terrific.
So,
Much appreciated.
Much appreciated. What we're going to try, what Dick and I will try to do before in sufficient time before the next meeting, is collect the questions, try to categorize them. We will try to get them out to you as a draft, straw man, only 40% there, no, they're not the final answer. But then maybe what we can do in the next meeting is start to say, do these sound like the right categories? Are there additional questions? Which ones do we think are the most important? How do we think as a committee we might tackle them? Okay. Can I ask one other question, sorry, of the committee? So there are two different philosophies on how we communicate with the committee. One is send you information as it becomes available. So for example, when the minutes become available, send those out to you. When a presentation becomes available, send it out to you. If somebody thinks of a document, send it out to you, meaning you will get pinged multiple times, sometimes 4 times within 24 hours, as this one is. Or we can try to batch communications and group them together with a little more discipline on our end, meaning town, school, staff. Do people mind being pinged 4 or 5 times in a couple days, or do you want batch things?
Prefer to get them earlier, so.
Ping early.
I don't mind.
Great.
You don't have time to look at it all.
All right, good.
May I move that we send this team down to talk to Representatives Boehner and et al.? We might get, all government is local. You guys were terrific tonight.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Thank you.
So, Ann, I hate to tell you this, but it's closer to 50 than 40 years that MECCA's been around.
But it's just, I guess, when people say, aren't we one